There is a story they used to tell about the great houses of England in the years when Queen Mary came to call. Before her motor car turned up the drive, before the footman opened the doors and the household assembled to receive her, the owners would move quickly through their own drawing rooms, lifting the finest small things from the mantelpiece and the cabinet, the little jade carving, the enamel snuff-box, the miniature in its gold frame, and hiding them away in drawers and back rooms where royal eyes would not find them. They were not guarding against a burglar. The danger was the Queen herself, because everyone in that world knew what happened when Mary of Teck admired something in your house. She would praise it. She would linger over it, turning it in her gloved hands. She would remark, in that precise and gracious way of hers, how very much she had always wanted one exactly like it, or how lonely the piece looked without the companion she happened to own. And by some unwritten rule that no one could quite name and no one dared to break, the thing would end up, sooner or later, belonging to her. The title of this story says, "Her obsession nearly bankrupted the royal collection." The truth is stranger than that, and in some ways harder. Mary of Teck did not bankrupt the royal collection. She may have been the best thing that ever happened to it. She is counted today among the handful of people who built it, the ones who turned a scattered jumble of royal possessions into one of the greatest collections on earth, and she did it by recovering treasures that earlier monarchs had sold off and thrown away, hunting down the lost relics of her own dynasty and bringing them home. Where the title says she drained the collection, the record says she rescued it. And yet the darker story is true as well, running alongside the noble one and never quite separable from it. Because the woman who saved the royal collection also acquired with a relentlessness that the polite world around her had no way to refuse, turning her admiration into a kind of soft-taking, building her treasures in part out of the simple and devastating fact that almost no one in England could bring themselves to say no to a queen. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Behind the gracious connoisseur was a grasping one, and behind the grasping one was something sadder still. This is the story of where that hunger came from, and what it cost, and who paid for it. Of a girl raised in genteel poverty whose own family fled the country to escape its creditors, who learned young that money vanishes and status is fragile, and beautiful things are the only security no one can take from you. Of a woman who could pour herself into objects and could not pour herself into her own children, and of a crown that taught her and rewarded her for believing that the accumulation of treasure was very nearly the same thing as love. The future Queen of England was born into a family that was, by the standards of the world it moved in, quietly and persistently broke. Princess Victoria Mary of Teck came into the world on the 26th of May, 1867, at Kensington Palace in London, and from the very first she occupied a strange and uncomfortable position, royal and not royal at the same time, grand in title and shabby in circumstance. The family called her May, after the month of her birth, and the name stuck through her childhood and into her young womanhood, a soft and ordinary name for a girl whose life would turn out to be anything. But to understand the woman she became, and the hunger that drove her, you have to understand the precise nature of the family she was born into, because it was a family that embodied a particular and painful kind of failure, the failure of people who have the rank of royalty without the money or the security that is supposed to come with it. Her mother was the genuine article, royal blood of the first water. Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge was a granddaughter of King George III, the daughter of one of that king's sons, the Duke of Cambridge, and a first cousin of Queen Victoria herself. By birth she stood close to the centre of the British royal family, a princess of the blood, related to the throne by the most direct and unimpeachable descent. She was also, by all accounts, a warm and jolly and enormously popular woman, large in body and large in personality, beloved by the public for her charitable works and her cheerful manner, the kind of royal that ordinary people genuinely liked. But Mary Adelaide carried two great handicaps that shaped her daughter's entire life. The first was that she had married late and married down. The second, and the more consequential, was that she was hopeless, catastrophically and incurably hopeless, with money. Mary Adelaide had expensive tastes and no discipline whatever in indulging them. She loved parties, fine clothes, good food, travel, the whole apparatus of an extravagant aristocratic life, and she pursued all of it with an enthusiasm that bore no relation to what she could actually afford. Her income was modest by the standards of her tastes, a parliamentary annuity of a few £1,000s a year, supplemented by what relatives could provide, and she spent far, far beyond it, year after year, with the serene confidence of a woman who had never quite grasped that money was finite. She gave generously, she lived lavishly, and she ran up debts on a scale that mounted steadily into a genuine crisis. The jolly, beloved princess was, behind the public warmth, a financial disaster, and the disaster would in time engulf her whole family and brand her eldest daughter with a lesson that May would never unlearn. The man Mary Adelaide had married made the family's position more precarious still, because he brought rank without standing and pride without resources. Francis, Duke of Teck, was May's father, and his background placed him in an awkward second tier of European royalty. He was the product of a morganatic marriage, a union between a prince and a woman of lower birth, the kind of marriage that European royal law treated as valid but lesser, stripping the children of full royal status and of any right to inherit thrones or fortunes. Francis had been born a count rather than a prince, raised to the princely title of Teck and later made a duke, but he carried in throughout his life the lower style of serene highness, rather than the royal highness that full royalty enjoyed, and he had no inheritance, no wealth, no kingdom, no money of his own to speak of. He was a handsome and proud man, saddled with a rank that sounded grand and meant little, dependent on his wife's royal connection for his place in the world, sensitive about his status and unable to do much to improve it. Queen Victoria, when asked, refused to elevate him to royal highness, a refusal that stung. The Tecks were royalty, but they were royalty of the poor and slightly embarrassing kind, grand enough to move in the highest circles and too broke to keep up with them, a family forever conscious of the gap between what their titles promised and what their bank accounts could deliver. This was the household into which May was born, and the contradiction at its heart, the contradiction of grandeur without security, would mark her for life. She grew up a princess, a great-granddaughter of a king of England, moving among palaces and royal relations, and she grew up watching her family slide steadily toward financial ruin, watching her mother spend what they did not have, feeling the particular shame of the poor relation, who must keep up appearances on means that will not stretch. It is a specific and corrosive kind of childhood, this experience of rank without resources, and it teaches specific lessons. It teaches that status is fragile and money is precarious. It teaches the humiliation of being looked down upon by people richer than yourself, despite your royal blood. And it can teach, in a certain kind of child, a deep and lasting craving for the security and the permanence that family so conspicuously lacked, a hunger for the solid, beautiful, valuable things that wealth provides, and that once possessed, cannot easily be taken away. The crisis came to its head in 1883, when May was 16, and it took a form that would have burned itself into any adolescent's memory. The Tecks' debts had grown so large, and their creditors so insistent, that the family could no longer remain in England. They were forced to flee. To escape the people they owed money to, the Duke and Duchess of Teck packed up their household and left the country, going abroad to live more cheaply on the continent until their finances could recover, a retreat that was, in plain terms, the flight of a debtor family running from its creditors. They travelled to Florence, in Italy, and stayed for periods with relatives in Germany and Austria, wandering Europe in a genteel exile imposed by their own insolvency. And in a detail that captures the whole sad comedy of the Teck position, they at first travelled incognito, under the assumed names of the Count and Countess von Hohenstein, attempting to move quietly and avoid the expense and attention that their real identity would attract. The disguise did not last. Mary Adelaide, unable to bear travelling without the deference her rank commanded, soon abandoned the pretense and reverted to her royal style, because being a princess got her better rooms and better service, even as a princess on the run from her debts. The family fled to economize, and then could not quite bring itself to economize, and the contradiction was Mary Adelaide to the life. For the 16-year-old May, the flight to the continent was a humiliation, the public confirmation of everything precarious and shameful in her family's position. But it was also, in a way that mattered enormously for the rest of her life and education. Because the cities the Tecks wandered through in their exile, and Florence above all, were among the great storehouses of art and beauty in the world, and May, the watchful and intelligent daughter, fell under their spell. In Florence she visited the art galleries, the churches, the museum, the palaces hung with masterpieces, immersing herself in the accumulated treasures of one of the most artistically rich cities on earth. The flight that had been forced on her family by debt placed the young princess in the middle of more beauty than she had ever seen, and she responded to it with a passion that would never leave her. She developed, in those years of exile, the eye and the appetite of a connoisseur, a love of beautiful objects and works of art, and the history they carried, a love that was nurtured precisely in the period of her family's deepest financial disgrace. The seeds of the great collector were planted in the soil of bankruptcy, and the connection is not an accident. The girl who had so little, whose family had fled its creditors, learned to love the beautiful and the permanent and the valuable in the very years when her own family's security had collapsed entirely. Set those two things side by side, because together they explain so much of what came after. May grew up amid financial ruin and the humiliation it brought, learning in her bones that money vanishes and status is fragile, and the things you possess can be lost. And she grew up, in the same years, falling in love with beautiful objects, with art and treasure, and the solidity and history they represented. The combination is potent. A child taught that everything can be taken away, who simultaneously discovers a passion for beautiful things that seem to last forever, may very well grow into an adult for whom the possession of such things becomes something close to a need, a hedge against the insecurity she knew too well, a way of holding on to permanence in a world that had shown her how quickly everything could collapse. The future Queen Mary, obsessive collector of treasures, was being formed in the wandering, debt-ridden, beauty-soaked exile of her 16th year, and the obsession that would later empty the drawing rooms of England had its origin in a family that could not pay its bills. There was another lesson that Teck childhood taught May, and it concerned the difference between herself and her chaotic, beloved, hopeless mother. Where Mary Adelaide was extravagant and undisciplined and warm to the point of being out of control, May grew up to be the opposite, controlled, careful, reserved, sensible to a fault. It was as though the daughter, watching the damage her mother's lack of discipline had done, resolved at some level never to be like that, never to be the one whose feelings and appetites ran away with her and brought disaster. May became, even as a young woman, notably steady and self-contained, a person who held herself in check, who suppressed and controlled and managed her emotions rather than letting them spill out, who valued order and propriety and restraint above the warm chaos her mother embodied. This too would shape her whole life. The rigid self-control, the suppression of feeling, the preference for order over emotion, and it too can be traced to the childhood, among the consequences of her mother's lack of control. May learned to be the opposite of Mary Adelaide, and the lesson made her formidable and reliable, and in time magnificent, and it also made her cold. A woman so practiced in suppressing her own feelings that she would struggle, later, to express love even to her own children. The Tecks, from their continental exile in 1885, their finances somewhat repaired, and resumed their life in England, living at White Lodge in Richmond Park and in apartments at Kensington Palace, the homes that Queen Victoria's charity provided them, since they could not have afforded grand residences of their own. May grew into young womanhood as what she had always been, a princess of the blood without a fortune, a great-granddaughter of King George III, living on the edge of the royal world, grand in lineage and modest in means, often overlooked, sometimes snubbed by a high society that knew exactly how poor the Tecks really were. She was intelligent, well-read, fluent in English and German and French, possessed of real cultivation and a serious mind, and she was also in the marriage market of European royalty, a difficult proposition, a princess whose blood was good, but whose money was absent, and whose father's morganatic taint was a mark against her. She seemed destined, as the 1880s wore on, for the unenviable life of the poor royal relation, dependent and overlooked, a princess in name, with little prospect of the grand future that her birth might have promised in a family with money behind it. And then in the most extraordinary reversal, the very qualities that her hard childhood had forged in her, the steadiness, the sense, the self-control, the reliability, caught the eye of the one person in the world who could change everything, and the impoverished princess on the fringe of the royal family was about to be lifted, almost overnight, toward the throne itself. Queen Victoria, casting about for a suitable bride for the heir to the heir, for the young man who stood second in line to become king, looked past the absence of money and the morganatic taint, and saw in Mary of Teck exactly the qualities she wanted in a future queen. The transformation that was about to occur, the elevation of the poor relation into the destined consort, would be so sudden and so complete that it must have seemed to May like a kind of magic, a rescue from precariousness into the very heart of the institution she had always orbited from the outside. How that reversal came about, the choice that Queen Victoria made, the tragedy that struck before it could be fulfilled, and the strange way May was passed from one royal brother to another like a dynastic asset too valuable to waste, is where the story turns next. Because the manner of her rise, the way the institution reached down and lifted her out of her family's failure, would shape forever how Mary felt about the crown that had saved her, and would help to explain the lifelong devotion, bordering on obsession, that she would pour into its service and into the treasures that embodied its permanence. The thing that rescued Mary of Teck from her family's failure was the very quality that failure had forged in her, the steadiness, the self-control, the sensible reserve she had built as a defense against her mother's chaos. These were exactly the qualities that the most powerful woman in the world was looking for, and in the early 1890s Queen Victoria's eye fell upon the poor relation and saw in her not the absence of money or the morganatic taint, but the presence of something the royal family badly needed. Victoria needed a wife for a troubled grandson, a steadying influence for a young man who worried everyone around him, and she looked past everything that polite society held against the Tecks and chose May. With that choice, the princess on the fringe of the royal world, the daughter of a family that had fled its creditors, was lifted in a single stroke toward the throne of the British Empire. The grandson in question was Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, known in the family as Eddie, and he was a problem. He was the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, which made him second in line to the throne after his father, the young man who would one day be expected to become king, and he was, by the general assessment of those around him, not at all equal to the prospect. Eddie was languid, vague, and slow, a young man who seemed perpetually half asleep, lacking the application and the seriousness that his position demanded. His education had been a struggle. His attention wandered. There were worries about his character, rumours about his conduct, a general sense among the family and the courtiers that this heir to the heir was weak, unfocused, and in need of saving from himself. The standard remedy for a troubled prince in that era was a strong and sensible wife, a woman who could steady him, organize him, give his life the structure and purpose he could not supply for himself. And the search for such a woman was the search that brought Mary of Teck to the center of everything. Victoria's reasoning, in choosing May, tells you a great deal about how the institutions regarded the women it selected, and about the particular value it placed on the qualities May possessed. The Queen admired May's steady character, her good sense, her intelligence and cultivation and self-discipline, and she judged that this was precisely the kind of woman who might make something of the unpromising Eddie. The poverty of the Tecks, which had made May a poor marriage prospect in the ordinary calculations of royalty, was set aside in favour of her character, because what the family needed was not money, of which the royal family had plenty, but a wife of substance and sense to prop up a failing heir. May was chosen, in other words, for her usefulness, for what she could do for the dynasty, for her fitness to perform a role, rather than for any consideration of her own happiness or desire. She was a sensible solution to a dynastic problem, and the institution selected her the way one selects the right tool for a difficult job. The engagement was arranged, and in December 1891 Mary of Teck became betrothed to the future king. The transformation in her circumstances was staggering and sudden. One moment she was the impoverished daughter of a debt-ridden family, a princess overlooked and sometimes snubbed, with no great future in prospect. The next, she was the affianced bride of the second in line to the throne, the woman destined to be Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India, lifted overnight from the fringe of the royal world to its very centre. For a young woman who had grown up amid financial ruin and the humiliation of the poor relation, the elevation must have felt like a rescue almost beyond belief. The institution reaching down and plucking her out of precariousness and setting her on the path to the highest position a woman could hold. She had been saved, and she had been saved by the crown, and the gratitude and devotion that this rescue planted in her would shape the whole of the rest of her life. And then 6 weeks later it was all thrown into chaos by death. In January 1892, a wave of influenza was sweeping through Britain, part of a great pandemic that killed many thousands across Europe, and Eddie fell ill. The influenza turned to pneumonia, and the young prince, never robust, could not fight it off. On the 14th of January 1892, just weeks after his engagement to May, Prince Albert Victor died at Sandringham. 28 years old, the heir to the heir suddenly gone. The death was a genuine shock, a tragedy for his family and a crisis for the succession, and it left May in the strangest and most painful of positions. She had been betrothed for barely a month. She had been lifted toward the throne, and then, before the marriage could even take place, the man who was her route to it was dead. She was a bride without a groom, her dazzling new future extinguished almost before it had begun, thrown back, it seemed, toward the obscurity from which she had so briefly been raised. What happened next is one of the coldest and most revealing episodes in the whole story of how the British monarchy manages its dynastic affairs, and it shows with brutal clarity how the institution regarded May. Because May was not thrown back into obscurity, she was instead redirected. The royal family had identified her as the ideal wife for the future king, had judged her perfectly suited to the role of queen consort, and the death of Eddie did not change that judgment. It simply changed the identity of the groom. Eddie was dead, but the throne now passed to his younger brother, Prince George, Duke of York, who became in his turn the heir to the heir, the young man who would one day be king, and the obvious solution to the families and to Queen Victoria was that May, the suitable bride, should marry the new heir instead. The woman who had been chosen for Eddie would simply be transferred to George. The bride would be passed from the dead brother to the living one, redirected toward the new occupant of the position she had been selected to fill, like an asset too valuable to waste merely because its intended owner had died. Consider what this meant for May as a human being, because the dynastic logic, however practical, was a cold thing to be on the receiving end of. She had been engaged to one man who had died, and now she was to marry his brother, not out of love, not because she and George had chosen each other, but because the institution had decided that she was the right wife for whoever happened to occupy the role of future king, and George now occupied it. She was being treated as a fixture of the position rather than a person with her own heart, a suitable consort to be attached to whichever prince was next in line. The arrangement was engineered with a period of decent mourning to make it seem less unseemly, but the essential fact was plain enough. May was so useful to the dynasty that her engagement could survive the death of her fiancé and simply be reassigned to his replacement. The institution had found the wife it wanted, and it was not going to let a small matter like the death of the groom stand in the way of acquiring her. To the credit of the two people actually involved, May and George, the redirected match became something better than its cold arrangement might have suggested. George, the new heir, was a different and in many ways finer man than his late brother, serious where Eddie had been vague, disciplined where Eddie had been languid, a naval officer with a sense of duty and order that matched May's own. In the shared grief of Eddie's death, and in the strange situation of being pushed toward each other by the needs of the dynasty, George and May found a genuine sympathy, a real and growing affection that would in time deepen into one of the more devoted royal marriages of the era. They were temperamentally suited, both reserved, both dutiful, both formed by a sense of obligation that ran deeper than romance. The match that had been arranged for the convenience of the crown turned out to be, by good fortune, a match that worked, and the two of them built on the foundation of duty a marriage of real and lasting attachment. In May 1893, George proposed and May accepted, and on the 6th of July 1893, They were married at the Chapel Royal of St. James's Palace in London. The impoverished princess from the debt-ridden family had become the Duchess of York, wife of the future king, her path to the throne restored after the detour of Eddie's death, her elevation now complete and permanent. The transformation that had begun with Victoria's choice was sealed by the marriage, and Mary of Teck, who had grown up amid financial ruin and the humiliation of the poor relation, was now established at the very heart of the British royal family, the destined queen of an empire that covered a quarter of the globe. And here the story circles back to its central theme, because the wedding marked the moment when the woman who had grown up with so little was suddenly buried in treasure, and the contrast must have struck deep into a soul shaped by years of want. The marriage of a future king and queen drew an avalanche of wedding gifts, and May was showered with jewels and precious objects on a scale she could scarcely have imagined in her impoverished girlhood. When the gifts were catalogued and counted, the brooches alone numbered more than 40, an array of diamonds and pearls and sapphires and emeralds and rubies, presented by family, friends, committees, towns, counties, and well-wishers across the kingdom, a glittering trove that formed the foundation of what would become one of the greatest collections of royal jewelry in history. The girl whose family had fled its creditors, who had learned in exile that money vanishes and security is fragile, was now the recipient of a fortune in gems and treasures, the poor relation transformed into the owner of jewels beyond price. It is impossible to know exactly what passed through May's mind as the treasures accumulated around her, but the psychological logic is not hard to trace, and it connects directly to the obsession that would define her later life. Here was a woman who had known the insecurity of poverty in a royal family, who had felt the precariousness of status without wealth, who had developed in her years of exile a deep love of beautiful and valuable objects, and now, through her marriage to the future king, she was suddenly possessed of treasure on Sandkel that promised exactly the security and permanence she had always lacked. The jewels and the objects were not merely pretty things, they were solidity, value, possession, the tangible proof that the precariousness of her childhood was over, that she had reached a place of safety where beautiful things flowed toward her, rather than away. For a woman shaped as May had been shaped, the accumulation of such treasure must have answered a hunger that ran very deep, and the wedding that buried her in jewels may have been the moment when the collector was truly born, the moment when a love of beauty nurtured in poverty met, at last, the means and the position to indulge it without limit. The deeper imprint of these years, though, was not about objects at all, but about the institution, and it would shape Mary's entire understanding of her place in the world. Because May owed everything to the crown. The royal family had reached down and lifted her out of her family's failure, had chosen her, elevated her, restored her after Eddie's death, made her a duchess and a future queen, transformed her circumstances from precarious obscurity to the highest security and grandeur. Everything she had become through the institution of monarchy, through its choice and its favor and its power to remake a person's life. And a woman saved so completely by an institution tends to develop a particular relationship with it, a gratitude that shades into devotion, a loyalty that runs to the bone, a sense that she owes the institution everything and must repay it with everything she has. May's devotion to the crown, which would become one of the defining features of her character, the absolute, almost worshipful commitment to the monarchy and its dignity and its continuity, was rooted in this fundamental fact that the crown had been her salvation, that the institution had given her a life she could never have had without it. She would spend the rest of her days repaying that debt, pouring herself into the service of the monarchy with a dedication that bordered on the religious, and the treasures she would later accumulate were bound up with this devotion, because the treasures embodied the permanence and the legitimacy and the glory of the very institution that had saved her. This is the connection that explains so much of what came later, the link between the rescued poor relation and the obsessive collector and the rigid servant of the crown. May had been saved by the institution from the insecurity of her family's failure, and she responded with a lifelong devotion to that institution and to the treasures that represented its permanence. The crown had given her security, and she would spend her life securing the crown, hunting down its scattered treasures, recovering its lost relics, building up the collection that embodied its continuity, guarding its dignity with a ferocity that admitted no exceptions. Her obsession with royal treasure was, at its root, an expression of her gratitude and her devotion, the poor relation's determination to honor and strengthen the institution that had lifted her out of poverty. The woman who had learned in exile that everything can be taken away would devote herself to gathering and protecting the treasures of the crown that had given her everything, as though by securing the dynasty's possessions she could secure the permanence she had never known in her own precarious childhood. The character that would carry her through her long reign was now essentially formed. The self-control, the suppression of feeling, the reserve learned as a defense against her mother's chaos, the love of beautiful objects nurtured in exile, the hunger for security and permanence bred by poverty, the devotion to the institution that had saved her, and binding all of it together, the lesson that had been taught and retaught throughout her formative years, that duty and propriety and the demands of the role must always come before the self, that one suppressed one's own feelings and served the larger thing, that what mattered was not personal happiness, but the fulfillment of one's obligations to the family and the crown. Mary of Teck had become a woman of formidable discipline and devotion and reserve, magnificent in her commitment to duty and constrained, profoundly constrained, in her capacity to feel and express the warmth that duty had taught her to suppress. She would carry all of this into her marriage and into her reign, and it would make her, in time, one of the most impressive and one of the most forbidding queens in British history, a figure of immense dignity and granite self-control, who served the institution with absolute devotion and who struggled, all her life, to give love freely to the people closest to her. The collector, the curator, the obsessive accumulator of royal treasure was forming alongside the rigid and dutiful queen, and the two were aspects of the same person, the same psychology of control and security and devotion, expressing itself in the gathering of objects and in the suppression of self. The treasures she would pour herself into were the things she could love, without the danger that loving people carried, the safe objects of a passion that her emotional discipline permitted, and the collection she would build would become, in a sense, the place where she kept the feelings she could not otherwise express. How that collection grew, how the dutiful Duchess of York became the obsessive Queen Mary, and how her genuine and serious work as a connoisseur and curator of the royal collection began to take shape is where the story turns next. Because before we reach the darker side of her acquisitiveness, the soft coercion, and the grasping that emptied the drawing rooms of England, we have to understand the real and admirable achievement that lay alongside it, the genuine expertise and the genuine devotion that made Mary of Teck not merely a magpie, but one of the most knowledgeable and consequential royal collectors who ever lived. That achievement, and the obsession that drove it, is where we go now. The marriage that the dynasty had arranged turned, against the odds, into a partnership that lasted 43 years and held two people together through war and upheaval and the slow transformation of the world they had been born into. George and May suited each other in the deep way that matters more than romance, two reserved and dutiful people who understood each other's silences, and the affection that grew between them was real and durable, even if it was never demonstrative. They were not a passionate couple in any way the world could see. They were something that often lasts longer than passion, a pair of temperamentally matched people bound by shared values and mutual respect and a sense of duty that ran through both of them like a steel spine. George himself was a man cut very much from the cloth that May had learned to value. He was rigid, punctual, conservative, a stickler for routine and propriety and the correct way of doing things, a former naval officer who liked order and discipline and disliked change and novelty and anything that smacked of the modern or the bohemian. He kept to fixed habits with an almost obsessive precision. He distrusted intellectuals and artists and clever talk. He was, in his tastes and his temperament, a plain and conservative man who happened to be a king, more comfortable with his stamp albums and his shooting than with the glittering social world that surrounded the throne. And in May he found a wife who shared his reverence for duty and propriety, who would never embarrass him with emotion or extravagance, who understood as he did that the role came before the self. They built a marriage on those shared foundations, and it worked. A union of two controlled and dutiful people who had been pushed together by the dynasty and who made, out of that arrangement, something genuine and lasting. There is a detail about George that throws May's own obsession into sharp relief. Because the king was himself a collector, every bit as devoted and obsessive as his wife, only in an entirely different domain. George's passion was stamps. He was one of the most serious philatelists of his age, a man who poured enormous energy and considerable money into building what became the Royal Philatelic Collection, one of the great stamp collections in the world. He housed it in hundreds of albums, studied it with real expertise, and pursued rare specimens with the ardor of the true obsessive. There is a famous story that captures both his passion and his dry self-awareness. When George paid a record sum, £1,450, an enormous price for a single rare stamp, a courtier is said to have remarked to him that some damned fool had paid that much for one stamp, not realizing who the buyer had been. "Yes," George replied, "I was that damned fool." The story is told as a charming anecdote of royal good humor, but it also reveals something real, that the king understood his own collecting to be a kind of glorious folly, an obsession he indulged with full knowledge of how absurd the sums involved might seem to an outsider. The marriage of George and May was, then, in a sense the marriage of two obsessive collectors, the king with his stamps and the queen with her art and objects, each pursuing a passion for accumulation that consumed time and money and attention, each building a great collection in their chosen field. It is a striking thing, this household at the head of the empire, in which both husband and wife were driven by the collector's hunger, the relentless desire to acquire and complete and possess. They did not collect the same things, and their tastes had little overlap, George's stamps being a world away from May's furniture and jewels and objets d'art. But the underlying drive was the same, the deep satisfaction of the hunt, the completion of the set, the bringing together of scattered things into a whole that one owned and controlled, and could contemplate with pride. In this, at least, the king and queen were perfectly matched, two collectors who understood in each other the particular passion that drove them both. The trajectory of their lives carried them steadily toward the throne. They married in 1893 as Duke and Duchess of York. In 1901, when Queen Victoria died and George's father became King Edward VII, George and May became Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and York, and then, later that year, Prince and Princess of Wales, the heirs apparent to the throne. And in 1910, when Edward VII died, George became King George V and May became Queen Mary, consort of the King Emperor, the highest position a woman could hold in the British system. The poor relation from the debt-ridden family had reached the summit. The girl whose family had fled its creditors was now Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India, crowned at the coronation of 1911, established at the pinnacle of the institution that had saved her. It was around the time of her accession that May, who now took the regnal name Mary and became Queen Mary to the world, settled fully into the public persona that would define her for the rest of her life, and it is worth pausing on that persona, because it was a creation of formidable discipline, and it concealed as much as it displayed. Queen Mary became, over the years of her reign, one of the most recognizable and most imposing royal figures in the world, a woman of magnificent and forbidding dignity, instantly identifiable by her appearance and her bearing. She held herself with a rigid, upright posture that never relaxed. She dressed in a distinctive and unchanging style, the long elaborate gowns, the parasol, the toque hats perched high on her elaborately dressed hair, the magnificent jewels, an appearance that was deliberate and unvarying, and that projected an image of stately grandeur, frozen somewhere in the early years of the century. She rarely smiled in public. She moved through her duties with an air of immense gravity and control, a queen who seemed carved from something harder than flesh, the very image of royal dignity and self-command. This persona was, in large part, the public expression of the self-control that May had built since girlhood, the suppression of feeling raised to the level of a permanent royal style. The reserve she had learned as a defense against her mother's chaos, the discipline she had cultivated in opposition to Mary Adelaide's lack of it, hardened over the years into the granite composure of Queen Mary, a woman who had so thoroughly mastered the suppression of her own emotions that she presented to the world a face of unvarying, magnificent control. It was impressive, genuinely impressive, the dignity and the self-command of it, the sense of a woman utterly in command of herself and her role. And it was also in its way a kind of armor and a kind of prison, the lifelong suppression of feeling made into a permanent public mask, behind which the warmth and the spontaneity and the emotional life that the discipline forbade were locked away, expressed, if at all, only in private and only with difficulty. The magnificent Queen Mary was a triumph of self-control, and the triumph had a cost, and the cost was the freezing of the feelings that the control suppressed. Into this persona of rigid control and suppressed feeling, the obsession with collecting fitted with a kind of psychological inevitability, and it was now, in the years of her reign, that the obsession came fully into its own. Mary made it her mission as queen to devote herself to the royal collection, to the gathering and care and enrichment of the treasures of the crown, and she pursued this mission with the full force of her formidable energy and her formidable will. The collecting that had begun with the love of beauty, nurtured in her Florentine exile, and that had been fed by the avalanche of treasure that her marriage brought, now became the organizing passion of her life, the great project to which she gave herself with a dedication that bordered on the all-consuming. She had the position now, as queen, to indulge the passion without limit, the access and the authority and the prestige that made every dealer and every collector and every aristocrat in the kingdom eager to please her, and she used all of it in the service of her hunger to acquire. The connection between the suppressed feeling and the obsessive collecting is one that runs through the whole of Mary's story, and it is worth stating plainly, because it explains the intensity of a passion that might otherwise seem merely eccentric. Here was a woman who had trained herself over a lifetime to suppress her emotions, to hold herself in rigid control, to deny herself the free expression of feeling that her discipline forbade. And here was a passion, the collecting of beautiful objects, that offered a channel for emotion that the discipline permitted, a safe and acceptable object for the feelings that could not be directed at people. Mary could love objects in a way she could not love people, could pour into the pursuit and possession of beautiful things the passion and the devotion that her emotional armor prevented her from expressing in human relationships. The collection became, in a sense, the place where she kept her feelings, the acceptable outlet for a heart that had been disciplined into silence. The woman who could not embrace her children with warmth could pursue a piece of jade with ardor. The feelings had to go somewhere, and they went into the objects, into the hunt and the acquisition and the possession, the treasures that filled her palaces and her life. And the things she pursued answered, as well, the other great need that her childhood had bred in her, the need for security and permanence. The treasures Mary gathered were solid, valuable, lasting, the opposite of the precariousness she had known in her impoverished youth. To accumulate them was to build a fortress of permanence against the insecurity that had marked her early life, to surround herself with the tangible proof that the precariousness was over, that she had reached a place where beautiful and valuable things flowed toward her and stayed. The collecting answered both needs at once, the need for an outlet for suppressed feeling, and the need for security against remembered precariousness, and the combination made it not a hobby but a compulsion, a passion that ran to the deepest roots of her psychology, and that would drive her, relentlessly, for the rest of her long life. So by the second decade of the 20th century the elements were all in place. The magnificent and forbidding queen, the devoted servant of the crown that had saved her, the obsessive collector, driven by suppressed feeling and the hunger for security, the connoisseur whose eye had been trained in the galleries of Florence, and whose appetite had been whetted by the treasures of her marriage. Queen Mary was ready to embark on the great project of her life, the enrichment of the royal collection, and she would pursue it for decades with an energy and a determination that would make her one of the most consequential collectors in the history of the British monarchy, and with a relentlessness that would, in its darker expressions, empty the drawing rooms of the aristocracy and brand her with a reputation that has followed her ever since. The achievement was real, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms, before the darker side is reckoned with, because Mary was not merely a grasping accumulator, but a serious and knowledgeable force, who did genuine and lasting good for the collection she devoted herself to. Her work as a connoisseur and a curator, her real expertise, her detective's passion for research and cataloguing, her mission to recover the scattered and lost treasures of her dynasty, all of this constitutes a genuine and important achievement, the admirable face of an obsession that also had a far less admirable one. To understand Mary fully, you have to hold both faces at once, the serious connoisseur and the grasping magpie, the saviour of the collection, and the woman who could not be refused, and the place to begin is with the achievement, with the real and substantial good that her obsession, at its best, accomplished. How Mary became not merely a collector, but a curator and a connoisseur of genuine seriousness. What drove her mission to recover the lost treasures of her dynasty, and why the sale of a dead king's possessions 3 centuries earlier could still make her blood boil, is where the story turns next. Because the obsession that would later look so grasping had at its heart something almost noble, a devotion to the recovery and preservation of the crown's heritage that did real and lasting good, and the tragedy and the complexity of Mary lie precisely in the fact that the same hunger produced both the achievement and the offence. That achievement, the serious and admirable work of the curator queen, is where we go now. To dismiss Queen Mary as a mere magpie, a grasping woman who simply liked to acquire pretty things, is to miss the most important truth about her collecting, which is that she was a serious scholar of the objects she pursued, and that her obsession was harnessed, at its best, to a genuine and consequential mission. She was not an amateur with an eye for shiny things. She was a connoisseur of real learning and a curator of real dedication, and the work she did for the royal collection was substantial enough that she is counted today among the small number of people who actually built it. What set Mary apart from previous royal collectors and what marks her as something more than an accumulator was her commitment to the unglamorous, painstaking work of scholarship. She did not merely buy and gather. She researched, organized, catalogued, and displayed, throwing herself into the detailed and laborious business of understanding what the crown actually possessed and where it had come from. Earlier royal collectors had acquired on a grand scale, but few of them had cared to do the patient archival work of documenting and arranging what they owned. Mary cared intensely. She loved the detective work of tracing an object's history, of establishing its provenance, of working out which piece had belonged to which ancestor and how it had come into the family. She pored over inventories and catalogues and old records, hunting down the stories of the objects in her care, and she took a genuine and personal pleasure in the slow accumulation of knowledge that real connoisseurship requires. There is a glimpse of her at this work that captures both her dedication and her frustration, and it comes from her involvement with the museums and the records of the royal possessions. Faced with a collection of royal heirlooms whose history had been lost, whose provenance was undocumented, whose stories had simply vanished for want of any written record, Mary lamented the absence of the very information she craved. "Oh dear," she once exclaimed about a collection of objects whose history she could not establish, "if only I could find the history of all these things. How interesting it would be, but there is no inventory, nothing." The cry is revealing. It is the cry of a true scholar confronted with the chaos and carelessness of the past, the despair of a woman who wanted to know and to document and to understand, faced with the maddening absence of the records that would have let her do so. This was not the frustration of a mere acquirer. It was the frustration of a curator, a person for whom the history and the documentation of the objects mattered as much as their possession. Mary's seriousness as a curator showed itself, too, in her work to consolidate the scattered possessions of the crown, to bring together what had been dispersed, and to put the royal collection in order. One concrete example stands out. In 1919, Mary arranged for the return to Buckingham Palace of historic royal objects that had been on loan to the Victoria and Albert Museum, gathering back into the royal possession items that had drifted out of it, reasserting the crown's ownership of its own heritage. This was the work of a woman who saw the royal collection as a coherent whole that ought to be consolidated and cared for, not a scattering of objects to be left wherever they happened to have ended up. She wanted the things brought together, documented, organized, displayed, treated as the unified treasure of the dynasty rather than as a careless jumble dispersed across museums and storerooms and forgotten corners. The instinct was curatorial in the truest sense, the instinct to gather and order and preserve, and it did real good for a collection that had suffered from centuries of neglect and dispersal. And here we reach the deepest motive behind Mary's collecting, the thing that gave her obsession its peculiar intensity and its sense of mission, and it is a motive that connects directly to her devotion to the crown and to her own history. Mary was haunted by the dispersals of the past, by the times when earlier monarchs had carelessly or desperately sold off the treasures of the crown, scattering to the winds the relics that ought to have been preserved for the dynasty forever. The losses of the past tormented her, and the recovery of what had been lost became for her something close to a sacred duty. Three great dispersals weighed on her mind above all others. There was the sale, in 1819, of the private collection of Queen Charlotte, the wife of George III, a dispersal that Mary regarded as a sacrilege, the scattering of treasures that should have remained with the family. There was the sale, in 1830, of gold and jewels belonging to George IV, another careless throwing away of royal treasure. And there was, above all, the greatest and most painful dispersal of them all, the sale in 1649 of the goods of King Charles I, after his execution by Parliament, when the possessions of the beheaded king were sold off and scattered across Europe in a deliberate dismantling of the royal heritage. This last dispersal seems to have wounded Mary most deeply of all, and her reaction to it reveals the whole emotional logic of her collecting. Reading a copy of the catalogue of the 1649 sale of the dead king's goods, learning that even the garter robes worn by Charles I had been sold off, Mary exclaimed that it made her blood boil to think that all these historical relics should have disappeared. Her blood boiled. The phrase is not the language of a casual collector. It is the language of a woman for whom the loss of royal treasure was a kind of violation, an outrage that stirred her to genuine anger across the gulf of 3 centuries. There is something deeply revealing in the particular nature of Mary's distress over the 1649 sale, because she did not separate the dispersal of the collection from the deposition of its owner. To Mary, the selling off of Charles I's goods was bound up with the killing of Charles I himself, the scattering of the treasures inseparable from the destruction of the king. The objects and the monarchy were, in her mind, one thing, the treasures embodying the dynasty, the dispersal of the treasures a kind of attack on the institution itself. This is the key to understanding the whole emotional and ideological foundation of her collecting. For Mary, royal objects were not merely valuable or beautiful. They were the physical embodiment of the monarchy's continuity and legitimacy, the tangible proof of the dynasty's endurance through time, sacred relics whose preservation was bound up with the very survival and dignity of the crown. To recover a lost royal treasure was to restore a piece of the dynasty's integrity, to heal a wound in the body of the monarchy, to reassert the continuity that the dispersals had broken. The collecting was, in this light, not acquisitiveness but restoration, the gathering back of the scattered heritage of the crown, the repair of the damage that careless or desperate ancestors had done. This ideology gave Mary's collecting its mission and its intensity, and it shaped the particular character of her acquisitions. Because Mary, for the most part, was not trying to impose her own taste or to build a collection that reflected her own personality. She was trying to fill the gaps, to recover what had been lost, to supplement the strengths of the existing collection, and to reverse the regrettable dispersals of the past. Her activities, as one assessment of her collecting has put it, were almost pointedly self-effacing, the work of tidying the chaotic leavings of earlier royal collectors and bringing back what should never have been let go. She trawled the dealers' shops and the auction catalogues, not to gratify a personal aesthetic, but to hunt for the lost relics of her dynasty, the things that had wandered out of the royal possession and ought to be brought home. The sale of Charlotte's collection, the dispersal of George IV's gold, the scattering of Charles I's goods, these were on her mind as she searched, the losses she was trying, piece by piece, to make good. Her collecting had the character of a rescue mission, a decades-long effort to recover and restore the heritage of the crown. When you understand this, the figure of Mary the collector becomes far more sympathetic and far more impressive than the magpie of legend. Here was a woman who had devoted herself, with real scholarship and real dedication, to the recovery and preservation of the treasures of the institution she revered, who had made it her life's mission to repair the damage of past dispersals and to consolidate the scattered heritage of the Crown, who did genuine and lasting good for one of the great collections of the world. The royal collection as it exists today, the magnificent assemblage of treasures housed in the royal palaces, owes a real debt to Mary's obsessive labour, to her hunting and gathering and recovering and cataloguing, to the decades she spent bringing back what had been lost and ordering what had been chaotic. She is rightly counted among the builders of the collection, alongside the great royal collectors of the past, and the achievement is substantial and real. And this is precisely why the darker side of her collecting is so difficult and so interesting, because it cannot be separated from the admirable side, because the same hunger that produced the achievement also produced the offence. The devotion to recovering lost royal treasure, noble as it was, ran in the same channel as the relentless acquisitiveness that emptied the drawing rooms of the aristocracy. The conviction that royal objects ought to be in royal hands, that the dynasty's heritage should be gathered and preserved, could shade very easily into the conviction that any beautiful object Mary admired ought to be hers, that her wish to possess a thing was a kind of higher claim that overrode the ordinary rights of its owner. The mission to recover the scattered treasures of the Crown and the habit of acquiring whatever she fancied from the houses of her hosts were not two separate things. They were the same drive, the same hunger, the same conviction of royal entitlement to beautiful objects, expressed in a noble form and in a grasping one. And the tragedy and the complexity of Mary lie in the fact that you cannot have one without the other. Consider how the noble motive could become the grasping one with only the smallest shift of emphasis. Mary believed that royal treasures belonged with the Crown, that beautiful objects of historical or artistic value ought to be preserved in the great collection rather than scattered among private owners who might not appreciate or care for them properly. This belief, applied to the recovery of genuinely royal relics, was the foundation of her admirable work. But the same belief, applied more broadly, could justify the acquisition of almost anything she wanted, because almost any beautiful object could be reframed in her mind as something that ought to be in the royal collection, something better preserved and appreciated in royal hands than in the hands of its current owner. The conviction that she was rescuing and preserving treasure for the dynasty could become a self-justifying license to acquire, a way of recasting her own acquisitiveness as a kind of public service, the gathering of beautiful things into the great collection where they belonged. And the people whose treasure she acquired, the aristocrats and the dealers and the favour-seekers, could be cast, in this logic, as the temporary custodians of objects that were destined for higher hands, their reluctance to part with their possessions, a kind of selfishness in the face of the Queen's noble mission of preservation. This is the slippery ground on which Mary's collecting moved, the ground where the connoisseur shaded into the magpie, where the rescuer of royal treasure became the woman who could not be refused. And it is on this ground that the darker stories of her acquisitiveness must be examined, the stories of the pointed admiration and the reluctant gifts and the hidden treasures, the reputation that has clung to her name for a century. Because the same Queen Mary who did such genuine good for the royal collection, who recovered the lost relics of her dynasty with real scholarship and real devotion, was also, by the persistent testimony of the world she moved in, a woman whose acquisitiveness had a coercive edge, who used the impossibility of refusing a queen to gather treasures that were never freely given, and whose collecting, for all its noble mission, had a shadow that the genteel reputation has never quite been able to dispel. How that shadow took shape, what exactly Mary did in the houses of her hosts, and how the line between the connoisseur and the coercer was crossed, is where the story turns next. Because the achievement was real, and so was the offence, and the time has come to reckon with the darker face of the obsession, the face that the great houses of England learned to fear and to hide their treasures from. That darker face, the soft coercion of the Magpie Queen, is where we go now. The scale of Queen Mary's collecting, once she had the position and the means to indulge it without limit, was enormous, and to understand the obsession you have to grasp how completely it filled her life. This was not a queen who collected as a pastime, an agreeable diversion from the duties of her role. This was a woman for whom the pursuit and acquisition of beautiful objects was very nearly the central activity of her existence, the thing she thought about and worked at and pursued with a relentless, tireless energy across decades. The collecting was not something she did, it was something she was. Her hunting grounds were the dealers' shops of England, and she worked them with the dedication of a true obsessive. She was a familiar figure in the antique trade, a queen who personally trawled the shops and the showrooms in search of treasures, who knew the dealers and the stock and the market with the expertise of a serious buyer. There were shops she favoured and returned to again and again. The firm of H. Blairman and Sons was one, a dealer in fine antiques where she was a regular and welcome customer, photographed in the shop in the 1930s, browsing the stock with the practiced eye of a connoisseur who knew exactly what she was looking at. The firm of W. F. Greenwood in the city of York was another perennial favourite, a place she returned to over the years in her endless search for objects to acquire. She rummaged and browsed and bought, working the dealers' shops with a passion that most queens would have left entirely to agents and advisors, throwing herself personally into the hunt because the hunt was the thing she loved. The image of Queen Mary in a dealer's shop, magnificent and forbidding in her royal dignity, peering at the stock with the sharp eye of an obsessive collector, captures something essential about her. The queen who could not stay away from the pursuit, who needed the thrill of the find and the satisfaction of the acquisition, the way other people need food or air. The objects she pursued ranged across the whole field of the decorative arts, but she had particular passions, and one of them illuminates her psychology with special clarity. Mary loved miniatures, the small and exquisite and perfectly made, the tiny objects that concentrate beauty and craftsmanship into a jewel-like scale. Her home at Marlborough House, in her later years, was described as a treasure store of small and beautiful works of art. The rooms filled with the diminutive objects she had gathered over a lifetime. There is something telling in this love of the miniature, this passion for the small and contained and perfect. The miniature is the world made manageable, beauty reduced to a scale that can be held in the hand and possessed completely, controlled and ordered and contained in a way that the larger and messier world cannot be. For a woman whose whole character was built on control, on the ordering and containing of a life that might otherwise have spilled into the chaos she had learned to fear, the love of the miniature has a certain logic. In the perfect, contained, controllable little object, Mary found something that answered her deep need for order and security, a world in miniature that could be possessed and arranged and held entirely within her power. This passion for the miniature found its grandest and most extraordinary expression in the project that became one of the most famous things associated with her name, Queen Mary's Doll's House. Built between 1921 and 1924, the Doll's House was not a toy but a monumental work of art, an enormous and fantastically detailed model of an aristocratic house created by some of the finest craftsmen and artists of the age. It was designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens, the greatest architect of the era, and it was built to an exquisite scale of perfection, every element working and complete, a miniature world realized with astonishing care. The house had running water and working lights. Its tiny library held real books written specially for it by famous authors, including a miniature volume by the writer Vita Sackville-West. The shelves filled with literature reduced to a scale that could fit in a doll's hand. Its cellars held tiny bottles of real wine. Its garage held miniature motor cars. Its rooms were furnished with perfect little objects made by master craftsmen, an entire grand house reproduced in miniature with a completeness and a quality that made it a genuine marvel. The project had been instigated as a gift to Mary by Princess Marie-Louise, who had drawn on her connections in the artistic world to assemble the army of craftsmen and artists who created it, and it became, when it was finished, a celebrated wonder, displayed to the public, and admired as one of the most remarkable examples of miniature craftsmanship ever made. The Doll's House captures, in its strange and elaborate perfection, the essence of Mary's collecting psychology. Here was the love of the miniature carried to its ultimate expression, an entire world reduced to a controllable, possessable, perfect scale ordered and complete, and held entirely within the bounds of the model. Here was the gathering of beautiful objects, the tiny treasures made by master craftsmen, assembled into a collection of exquisite things. And here was the Queen's passion realized on a monumental scale, a project of enormous ambition and expense devoted to the creation of a perfect, miniature world. The doll's house was in a sense Mary's collecting made into a single object, the love of the small and beautiful and controllable, given its grandest form, a fortress of miniature perfection in which everything was ordered and complete and safe. It is no accident that this most famous expression of her passion was a world in miniature, a controllable little universe of beautiful things, because that was, at the deepest level, what Mary's collecting was always reaching for, the creation of a realm of beauty and order and security that she could possess and control entirely, against the chaos and precariousness that her character had been built to resist. The obsession, then, consumed her, in the dealers' shops, and the auction rooms, and the great project of the doll's house, and the endless accumulation of objects that filled her homes. And it is worth pausing on what this obsession meant in human terms, on the way it occupied the central place in her life that other people fill with relationships and feeling, because Mary, the woman of suppressed emotion and rigid control, poured into her, collecting the energy and the passion and the devotion that her character would not let her pour into people. The hunt for objects, the satisfaction of the acquisition, the pleasure of the perfect, and the complete and the possessed. These were the emotional center of her life, the place where her feeling went. She could love a piece of jade, could pursue it with ardor and possess it with joy, in a way she could not love or pursue or embrace the human beings around her. The collection was where she kept her heart, the safe outlet for the passion that her discipline forbade in human relationships, and the very intensity of the obsession is a measure of how much feeling had been displaced from people onto objects, how completely the things had come to occupy the place that love and warmth and human connection occupy in a less guarded life. This connection between the obsession and the emotional suppression brings us to the psychological core of the whole story and to the link between Mary's collecting and her childhood of poverty and insecurity. The woman who had known the precariousness of a royal family without money, who had watched her own family flee its creditors, who had learned that status and security can vanish, surrounded herself as queen with treasure. The objects were security made physical, permanence made tangible, the solid and valuable and lasting things that could not easily be lost or taken away, accumulated as a hedge against the insecurity she had known and never forgotten. And the objects were also the recipients of the feeling she could not express to people, the safe objects of a passion that her emotional armor permitted. Security and feeling, the two great needs that her childhood had shaped, both found their answer in the obsession, and the obsession grew, accordingly, to fill her life, because it answered needs that ran to the very foundation of who she was. But an obsession of this intensity, in a woman of this position, could not always stay within the bounds of legitimate acquisition, of buying from dealers and recovering royal relics and commissioning miniature wonders. The hunger was too great and the position was too powerful, and the line between acquiring what was for sale and acquiring what one simply wanted began, in Mary's case, to blur, because the same passion that drove her through the dealers' shops drove her too into the houses of her hosts, into the drawing rooms of the aristocracy, where she encountered beautiful objects that were not for sale, that belonged to other people, that she nonetheless wanted with the full force of her collector's hunger. And it was here, in the gap between wanting an object and being able legitimately to acquire it, that the darker side of Mary's collecting took shape, the side that the great houses of England learned to fear. The mechanism was the soft coercion that her royal position made possible, the turning of admiration into a kind of taking, and it worked precisely because of the impossibility of refusing a queen. When Mary admired an object in a private house, she was not an ordinary guest expressing ordinary appreciation. She was the queen, the embodiment of the institution, a figure to whom enormous deference was owed, and whose wishes carried the weight of something close to command. And when such a figure made clear, in her gracious and pointed way, that she admired a thing and would be pleased to possess it, the owner was placed in an almost impossible position, caught between the natural desire to keep their own property and the powerful social pressure to gratify the wish of their sovereign. To refuse the Queen, to decline to give her the thing she had so clearly indicated she wanted, was a kind of social impossibility, a breach of the deference owed to the crown that few people in that world had the nerve or the rudeness to commit. And so the objects flowed toward Mary, given up by owners who could not bring themselves to refuse, surrendered under a pressure that was never quite stated but was perfectly understood. How exactly that pressure was applied, what Mary actually said and did in the houses of her hosts, why the aristocracy took to hiding their treasures before she came to call, and where the line falls between a great collector and a coercive one, is where the story turns next. Because the soft coercion of the Magpie Queen is the heart of the darker story, the thing that has clung to her reputation for a century, and it deserves to be examined closely and honestly, in all its uncomfortable detail, as the shadow side of the obsession that also did such genuine good. That soft coercion and the discomfort it caused is where we go now. The reputation that has clung to Queen Mary for a century rests on a particular and well-attested set of behaviors, and they all turned on the same devastating mechanism, the simple fact that the wish of a queen is not the same as the wish of an ordinary guest. To understand the darker side of her collecting, you have to understand exactly how the soft coercion worked, because it was rarely crude and never quite stated, and its power lay precisely in its subtlety, in the way it placed her hosts in an impossible position without ever once issuing a demand they could openly refuse. The basic move, the one that the great houses of England came to dread, was the pointed admiration. When Mary visited a private house and her collector's eye fell upon some beautiful object, a piece of porcelain, a jade carving, an enamel box, a miniature, she would make her appreciation unmistakably clear. She would admire the thing aloud, praise its beauty and its quality, linger over it with evident desire, and convey, in her gracious and unmistakable way, how very much she would be pleased to receive it as a gift, or perhaps to purchase it for some nominal sum. The admiration was not casual. It was directed, deliberate, freighted with an implication that everyone present understood perfectly. The Queen had seen something she wanted, and she had made her wish known, and the only question that remained was whether the owner would do the expected thing and surrender it. She had refinements of the technique, variations that made the pressure even harder to resist. Sometimes she would mention, on admiring an object, that she happened to own part of the same set, that she had pieces that matched this one, and that she would so love to complete the set she already possessed. The implication was clever and difficult to withstand, because it cast the owner's object not as a thing in its own right, but as a stray piece that properly belonged with Mary's collection, a fragment separated from its true home, which the owner was now in a position to restore to its rightful place. Other times, she would remark that an object looked lonely, that it wanted its companion, that it was incomplete or solitary, without the matching piece she owned, a sentimental framing that subtly suggested the object would be happier, more complete, more properly situated in her possession than in the owner's. These were not the blunt demands of a thief. They were the refined maneuvers of a woman who understood social pressure and royal deference and the psychology of her hosts, and who deployed all of it to bring the object she wanted into her own hands. The genius and the cruelty of the technique lay in the impossibility of refusing it without committing a social offence. Mary never demanded. She never took. She never said, "Give me that." She merely admired and indicated her pleasure and let the crushing weight of royal deference do the rest. And the owner, faced with the clearly expressed wish of the Queen, was trapped. To keep the object, to fail to offer it to the sovereign who had so plainly indicated she wanted it, was to commit a kind of rudeness toward the crown, a withholding that violated the deference owed to royalty, a churlishness that no one in that world wanted to be guilty of. The social cost of refusing was high, and the social pressure to comply was immense, and so the objects were given, surrendered by owners who would rather have kept them, but who could not bring themselves to deny their queen. The gift was extracted not by force, but by the sheer impossibility of saying no, by the weaponization of deference. By the way, Mary's royal position transformed a wish into something very close to a command. This is the point that must be grasped clearly. because it is the heart of the ethical problem with Mary's collecting. The objects she acquired in this way were, technically, gifts. No one was robbed, no threat was made. The owners handed over their treasures of their own apparent free will, presenting them to the Queen as presents. But the freedom was an illusion, because the gifts were given under a pressure that made refusal nearly impossible, extracted by the exploitation of royal deference, surrendered by people who did not want to part with them, but who had no socially acceptable way to refuse. A gift given because one cannot refuse is not a gift in any meaningful sense. It is a taking dressed in the clothes of a present, an acquisition accomplished through the soft coercion of social pressure rather than the hard coercion of force, but a coercion nonetheless. And Mary, whether she fully acknowledged it to herself or not, was the beneficiary of this coercion, the woman whose royal position turned her admiration into an irresistible claim, who built her collection, in part out of objects that were given because they could not be withheld. The evidence that contemporaries understood exactly what was happening lies in the famous response that Mary's behavior provoked, the response that has become one of the most repeated stories about her. The great houses of England, knowing what happened when Mary admired something, took to protecting themselves the only way they could. Before a royal visit, the owners of fine objects would hide their most prized possessions, removing them from view, putting them away in drawers and cupboards and back bappers where the Queen's eye would not fall upon them and where she could not, therefore, admire them into her own possession. The hiding of the treasures is the proof that the coercion was real and was understood. People do not hide their possessions from an ordinary guest who might admire them. They hide them from a guest whose admiration is dangerous, whose praise is a prelude to acquisition, whose wish to possess a thing carries a force that the owner cannot easily resist. The aristocracy of England, by hiding their treasures from their queen, confessed that they regarded her admiration as a threat to their property, a confession that tells you everything about how the soft coercion was perceived by the people on the receiving end of it. There is a further dimension to Mary's acquisitions that complicates the picture and adds another shade to the ethics of it, the dimension of the favour seekers. Not all of the objects that flowed toward Mary were extracted from reluctant owners. Many were given by people who wanted to please her, to curry favour, to win the approval and the goodwill of the Queen, by gratifying her known passion for beautiful things. The gift of a fine object to Mary was a way of ingratiating oneself with the crown, of earning royal favour, of placing the sovereign in one's debt, and there were always people eager to do exactly that, presenting Mary with treasures in the hope of advantage. Many of her most significant acquisitions, indeed, came as strategic gifts from friends, acquaintances, favour seekers and fellow collectors, objects given not under duress, but as deliberate bids for royal goodwill. This is a different kind of transaction from the soft coercion of the pointed admiration, but it is not entirely free of its own troubling quality, because it too rests on the exploitation of position, on the way Mary's royal status made her a magnet for gifts given in pursuit of favour, the recipient of a tribute that flowed toward her because of what she was, rather than because of any ordinary exchange. The objects came to her, one way or another, because she was the Queen, whether extracted from the reluctant or offered by the ambitious, and in both cases the acquisition was bound up with the power of her position in a way that ordinary collecting is not. So the question that hangs over the whole of Mary's collecting, the question that the darker stories force us to confront, is the question of where connoisseurship ends and appropriation begins. Was Mary a great collector who happened to have the misfortune of a position that made her acquisitions look coercive, or was she a coercive acquirer who used her royal status to take what she wanted under the cover of legitimate collecting? The honest answer is that she was both, that the line between the two cannot be cleanly drawn, that the same activity was, depending on how you look at it, both the admirable work of a connoisseur and the troubling exercise of royal coercion. When Mary admired an object in a private house and the owner felt compelled to give it to her, was that a gift or a taking? When she acquired a treasure through the pressure of royal deference, was she preserving a beautiful object for the great collection, or simply exploiting her position to satisfy her hunger? The answer depends on where you stand, on whether you focus on the genuine value of the objects and the genuine quality of the collection she built, or on the means by which the objects were acquired and the pressure under which they were given. Mary's collecting occupied exactly this ambiguous ground, neither simple theft nor innocent acquisition, but something in between, the gathering of treasures through a soft coercion that was real but never quite nameable, that produced a great collection through means that were never quite legitimate. And here the deeper point about royal power comes into focus, because Mary's collecting is in the end a study in how power operates in its softest and most deniable forms. There was no law that Mary broke. There was no theft, no fraud, no crude exercise of force. There was only the quiet, pervasive, irresistible pressure of royal position, the way the wish of a queen becomes a kind of command, the way deference transforms admiration into acquisition, the way the powerful can take what they want without ever appearing to take anything at all. This is power at its most refined and its most insidious, the power that operates through social pressure and the impossibility of refusal, rather than through any overt compulsion, the power that gets its way while maintaining the fiction that everyone involved is acting freely. Mary's collecting reveals this kind of power in action, the soft coercion of royalty, the extraction of treasures through the simple, devastating fact that no one can say no to a queen. And it reveals too the way such power launders itself, the way the coercion is disguised as gift-giving, the way the taking is dressed up as the owner's free choice, the way the whole transaction is made to look like generosity rather than appropriation. The objects that flowed toward Mary were, in the official story, gifts freely given to a beloved queen. In the truer story, they were treasures extracted by the pressure of a position that made refusal impossible. And the difference between those two stories is the difference between how power describes itself and how power actually works. This darker reading of Mary's collecting is the takedown that the genteel reputation conceals, the uncomfortable truth beneath the charming image of the magpie queen. But honesty requires that the darker reading itself be examined with care, because the reputation, real and well attested as it is, has also been exaggerated and distorted over the years, embellished into lurid stories that the serious record does not support. The line between the documented reputation and the lurid legend is itself a line that must be carefully drawn, because Mary has been accused of things that go well beyond the soft coercion that the evidence supports. Accused of outright theft, of kleptomania, of crude and criminal taking that the careful historical record does not bear out. To give an honest account of Mary, you have to separate what is genuinely attested from what is merely gossip and embellishment, to distinguish the real shadow from the lurid shadow play that has grown up around her name. How the reputation hardened into legend, what the lurid stories actually claim, why the serious biographers decline to repeat them, and where the honest line falls between the documented coercion and the unsubstantiated tale of the kleptomaniac queen is where the story turns next. Because the darker side of Mary is real, but it has also been distorted, and an honest reckoning requires not only confronting the genuine shadow, but also refusing to accept the exaggerations that have been piled upon it. That reckoning with the legend, the careful separation of the attested from the apocryphal, is where we go now. There is a point in the story of any notorious figure where the documented truth shades into legend, where the things that genuinely happened become tangled with the things that people merely said happened, and the figure passes from history into a kind of folklore that may bear only a loose relation to the facts. Queen Mary reached that point long ago, and the most lurid version of her reputation, the version that has her not as a coercive collector but as an outright thief, belongs firmly to the realm of legend rather than to the realm of established fact. An honest reckoning with Mary requires drawing this line carefully, separating what the record supports from what gossip and exaggeration have added, because the difference between the two is the difference between a fair judgment and a slander. The lurid version of Mary's reputation is the kleptomania story, and it has circulated for the better part of a century. In this telling, Mary was not merely a woman who acquired treasures through social pressure, the soft coercion of pointed admiration, and the impossibility of refusing a queen. She was, the gossip held, a genuine kleptomaniac, a compulsive thief who could not stop herself from taking things, whose relentless and unorthodox collecting was the symptom of a psychological disorder, a queen who would actually steal from her hosts, pocketing objects and removing them outright rather than waiting for them to be offered as gifts. The whispers that Mary was a kleptomaniac ran through palace gossip and through society for decades, a salacious rumor about the most regal and reserved and impeccably proper queen imaginable, the delicious contradiction of the dignified sovereign who was secretly a common thief. It is exactly the kind of story that takes hold and spreads, because it is so satisfyingly scandalous. The puncturing of royal dignity by a hidden vice, the magnificent Queen Mary reduced to a pilferer who could not keep her hands off other people's possessions. The kleptomania legend has been kept alive and amplified in the popular culture of our own time, most notably in a scene from the Downton Abbey film, which dramatized a fictional version of exactly this reputation, depicting royal acquisitiveness shading into something like theft, putting on screen for a mass audience the old story of the queen who took what she fancied. The dramatization, presented as entertainment and understood by its makers as a playful nod to a famous reputation rather than a historical claim, nonetheless reinforced the legend, planting in the minds of millions of viewers the image of the royal collector as a kind of glamorous thief. The story is, it must be admitted, a wonderfully entertaining one, the kind of thing that is irresistibly fun to imagine and to repeat. The proper and dignified queen secretly slipping treasures into her handbag, and its very entertainment value is part of why it has endured and spread, told and retold as a delicious piece of royal scandal. But here the honest historian has to stop and apply the discipline that separates fact from gossip, because the kleptomania story, entertaining as it is not supported by the evidence, and the careful record does not bear it out. There is no evidence to substantiate the claim that Mary was a kleptomaniac, or that she stole outright from her hosts. The story exists as rumor and gossip and dramatized entertainment, not as established fact, and the responsible treatment of it is to recognize it for what it is, a colorful legend that has grown up around a real but more limited reputation. The lurid version, in which Mary was a compulsive criminal thief, goes well beyond anything the record supports, and to repeat it as fact would be to slander a woman on the basis of gossip, to convict her of a psychological disorder and a pattern of theft for which there is no actual proof. The most telling evidence against the lurid version comes from the people best placed to know the truth, the serious biographers who have studied Mary's life in depth. James Pope Hennessy wrote the great official biography of Queen Mary, a work of deep research and full access, and Hugo Vickers has written extensively and authoritatively on the royal family and on Mary in particular. These are the historians who have examined her life most closely, who have had access to the records and the testimony and the documentation, who know the truth of her collecting better than anyone. And tellingly, neither Pope Hennessy nor Vickers repeats the lurid stories. The serious biographers, the ones who actually did the research, do not reference the tales of the pointed admiration extracting reluctant gifts, do not endorse the kleptomania legend, do not present Mary as a thief or a compulsive criminal. Their silence on these stories is significant because if the lurid version were well-founded, if there were real evidence for the kleptomania or the outright theft, these careful and authoritative biographers would presumably have addressed it. The fact that they do not, that the most serious students of Mary's life decline to repeat the most colourful accusations against her, is strong evidence that those accusations belong to gossip rather than to fact, to the folklore that has grown up around her rather than to the documented truth of her life. This leaves us with a careful and important distinction, the distinction between the documented reputation and the lurid legend, and it is a distinction that must be held firmly if Mary is to be judged fairly. The documented reputation is real. Mary was, by the well-attested testimony of the world she moved in, a woman of relentless acquisitiveness, a collector whose admiration of an object in a private house carried an implication that the owner found difficult to resist, a queen whose pointed appreciation could result in the object being given to her, a figure whose collecting habits led some of the great houses of England to take precautions with their treasures. This reputation is supported by the persistent and widespread testimony of contemporaries, by the famous stories of the hidden treasures, by the general understanding in that world of how Mary's acquisitiveness operated. It is real, and it constitutes a genuine shadow over her collecting, the soft coercion that we have already examined. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The lurid legend is something else. An exaggeration and a distortion of the documented reputation, the transformation of the coercive collector into the outright thief, the kleptomaniac queen who stole from her hosts. This version goes beyond the evidence, beyond what the serious record supports, into the realm of gossip and entertainment and salacious invention. And the honest treatment of Mary requires distinguishing the two, accepting the documented reputation as real while rejecting the lurid legend as unproven, holding her accountable for the soft coercion that the evidence supports while refusing to convict her of the theft and the kleptomania that the evidence does not. To collapse the distinction, to treat the lurid legend as established fact, would be to do Mary an injustice, to slander her on the basis of gossip, to convict her of crimes for which there is no proof, and to dismiss the documented reputation along with the lurid legend, to treat the whole of the darker story as mere gossip, would be to do an injustice of the opposite kind, to whitewash a collecting practice that genuinely had a coercive and troubling edge. The truth lies in the careful middle, in the acceptance of the real shadow and the rejection of the exaggerated one. It is worth asking why the lurid legend attached itself to Mary so persistently, because the answer illuminates something about how reputations form and about the particular vulnerability of a figure like her. The kleptomania story took hold and spread and endured for reasons that have as much to do with the appetite of the audience as with the facts of the case. It took hold because it was satisfying, because the image of the dignified and proper queen as a secret thief offered a delicious puncturing of royal pretension, the kind of scandalous contradiction that people love to repeat. It took hold because Mary's genuine and well-known acquisitiveness provided a foundation on which the exaggeration could build, a real reputation for relentless collecting that made the lurid version seem plausible, that gave the gossip something to attach to. It took hold because Mary's royal untouchability, the impossibility of openly accusing or confronting a queen, created a space in which gossip could flourish unchecked, in which whispers could circulate and grow, without ever being tested against the facts or answered by the accused. And it took hold because Mary was, in her rigid and forbidding magnificence, exactly the kind of figure that people enjoy bringing down, the impossibly dignified queen, whose secret vice would be all the more delicious for the contrast with her public grandeur. The persistence of the legend, then, tells us about the dynamics of reputation and gossip rather than about the truth of Mary's conduct. A real reputation for acquisitiveness, a royal position that placed her beyond open challenge, a public persona of forbidding dignity, and an audience hungry for scandal combined to produce a legend that exceeded the facts. The transformation of the coercive collector into the kleptomaniac queen, and the legend, once formed, took on a life of its own, repeated and embellished and dramatized, passing into the folklore of the royal family, attaching itself permanently to Mary's name. It is a cautionary tale about how easily a real but limited fault can be magnified into a lurid crime, how gossip fills the space that the facts leave empty, how a figure who cannot answer the charges against her becomes the repository of whatever scandalous stories the public chooses to believe. So where does this leave the honest judgment of Mary's collecting? It leaves us with a figure more complex and more carefully drawn than either the magpie legend or the noble connoisseur allows, a woman whose collecting was genuinely admirable in its scholarship and its mission, and genuinely troubling in its coercive edge, but who was not the outright thief that the lurid legend has made her. She did real good for the royal collection, recovering lost treasures and consolidating the dynasty's heritage with genuine expertise and devotion. She acquired some of her treasures through a soft coercion that was real and that her contemporaries understood, the pointed admiration that extracted gifts under the pressure of royal deference, and she did not, so far as the serious record shows, steal outright or suffer from the kleptomania that gossip attributed to her, the lurid legend going well beyond anything the evidence supports. The honest Mary is the connoisseur with the coercive shadow, not the magnificent thief of folklore, and to see her clearly, is to hold all of these truths together, the achievement and the coercion, and the rejection of the lurid exaggeration. This careful judgment of her collecting brings us back at last to the claim that the whole story began with, the claim embedded in the title, that her obsession nearly bankrupted the royal collection. We have seen enough now to weigh that claim honestly, to test the provocative framing against the documented truth, and the testing reveals a striking inversion, a gap between the sensational claim and the actual history that is itself revealing. Because the truth about Mary and the royal collection is very nearly the opposite of what the title suggests, and the real story of the financial and the ethical dimensions of her collecting is more interesting and more honest than the simple tale of a queen who drained the treasury. How the claim of bankruptcy holds up against the record, what the real financial and ethical costs of Mary's obsession actually were, and why it was not the royal collection but something else entirely that her hunger nearly bankrupted, is where the story turns next. Because the title makes a specific accusation, and honesty requires confronting it directly, and the confrontation reveals a truth that turns the whole sensational framing on its head. That confrontation with the bankruptcy claim and the inversion it reveals is where we go now. The title of this story makes a specific and dramatic accusation that Queen Mary's obsession nearly bankrupted the royal collection, and now that we have examined her collecting in full, the time has come to test that accusation against the record. It is the kind of claim that makes a compelling headline, the image of a queen so consumed by her hunger for treasure that she drained the resources of the crown, spent the dynasty toward ruin, threatened the very collection she was obsessed with. It is dramatic and it is memorable, and it is, when measured against the actual history, very nearly the opposite of the truth. Mary did not bankrupt the royal collection, she enriched it. This is not a matter of interpretation or sympathetic spin. It is the settled judgment of those who study the collection, the plain assessment of the institution itself. Mary is counted among the small handful of people who built the royal collection into what it is, named alongside the great royal collectors of the past, the monarchs and consorts whose acquisitions and care created one of the finest collections on earth. The official reckoning of who contributed most to the royal collection places Mary in the company of figures like George III, George IV, and Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, the builders rather than the depleters, the ones who added and consolidated and preserved. Far from draining the collection toward bankruptcy, she is regarded as one of its greatest benefactors, the woman who recovered its lost treasures, consolidated its scattered holdings, catalogued its chaos, and added to it on a substantial scale. The claim that she nearly bankrupted it inverts the truth so completely that it is worth pausing on the inversion, because the gap between the sensational accusation and the documented reality is itself instructive. Consider what Mary actually did for the collection, set against the charge of bankrupting it. She reversed the dispersals of the past, hunting down and recovering treasures that earlier monarchs had carelessly or desperately sold off, bringing back into the royal possession the relics that had been scattered. She consolidated the collection, gathering together objects that had drifted out of royal hands, arranging for the return of items that had been loaned away, bringing coherence to a holding that had suffered from centuries of neglect and dispersal. She catalogued and documented and researched, doing the unglamorous scholarly work that turned a chaotic accumulation into a properly understood and ordered collection. And she added to the collection on a large scale, her acquisitions, whatever their means, swelling the holdings of the crown with treasures that remain there to this day. The collection that exists now, the magnificent assemblage in the royal palaces, is richer and more coherent and better documented because of Mary, not poorer. The accusation of bankruptcy could hardly be more wrong. But it would be too simple and not entirely honest to leave the matter there, to dismiss the title's claim as pure invention and move on. Because while Mary did not bankrupt the royal collection in any literal financial sense, there is a real financial and ethical dimension to her obsession that deserves honest examination, a genuine set of costs that her collecting carried, even if those costs were not the bankrupting of the collection itself. The sensational claim is false, but it points, however crudely, toward a real area of concern, and the honest course is to identify what the actual costs of Mary's obsession were, rather than simply to celebrate her as a benefactor and ignore the troubling dimensions of her collecting. There was, first, a genuine financial dimension, the simple fact that collecting on Mary's scale cost money. She bought from dealers, purchased treasures at auction, and in the shops she frequented, spent real sums on the objects she acquired. The great project of the doll's house, with its army of master craftsmen and its exquisite miniature contents, was an expensive undertaking, a substantial investment of resources in a single elaborate object. The accumulation of a collection on the scale Mary achieved represented a real expenditure for flow of money toward the gratification of her obsession. None of this came close to bankrupting anything, the resources of the crown being more than equal to the cost of even an obsessive collector's purchases, but it was real spending nonetheless, the financial expression of a hunger that consumed not only Mary's time and energy, but also a meaningful quantity of money. And here the question of optics enters, the matter of how Mary's lavish collecting appeared against the background of the times in which she pursued it, because the years of her most intense acquisition were not years of universal prosperity and ease. Mary collected through the First World War, the catastrophe that killed millions and impoverished nations and brought hardship and grief to ordinary people across the empire. She collected through the years of economic depression that followed, the long downturn that threw millions out of work and brought real suffering to the populations over whom the monarchy presided. And throughout these years of war and depression and widespread hardship, the monarchy was at pains to present itself as a model of restraint and sympathy and shared sacrifice, to align itself with the struggles of ordinary people rather than to flaunt its wealth and privilege in the face of their suffering. The image the monarchy cultivated, especially under George V, was one of dull, dutiful, almost bourgeois respectability, a deliberate projection of thrift and steadiness and modest virtue, designed to make the crown seem in tune with the values of its hard-pressed subjects rather than remote and extravagant. Against this backdrop of cultivated royal thrift and shared sacrifice, the spectacle of the Queen relentlessly accumulating treasures carried a certain awkwardness, a tension between the image and the reality that is worth acknowledging. Here was the monarchy presenting itself as a model of restraint, and here was the Queen pursuing her expensive obsession with beautiful objects, trawling the dealers' shops, commissioning the lavish doll's house, gathering treasures on a grand scale, all while the populace endured war and depression and the crown preached the virtues of thrift. The contrast was not lost on everyone, and it represents a real, if minor, hypocrisy in the royal posture, a gap between the modest image and the acquisitive reality, between the thrift the monarchy preached and the treasure the Queen gathered. It is a small thing against the scale of the era's tragedies, and it did not bankrupt anything, but it is a genuine tension, a real cost to the integrity of the monarchy's self-presentation. The awkward fact of a queen indulging an expensive passion for treasure, while the institution she embodied asked everyone else to tighten their belts. The husband's parallel obsession sharpens the point, because George V, the very king who cultivated the image of dull bourgeois thrift, was himself spending record sums on his stamp collection, paying £1,450 for a single specimen at a time when such a sum represented many years of wages for an ordinary working family. The royal couple who presided over an empire preaching thrift and sacrifice were, in private, both obsessive collectors spending freely on their passions, the king on his stamps and the queen on her treasures, the gap between the public image of restraint and the private reality of indulgence running through both of them. There is no scandal of bankruptcy here, the crown's resources being ample, but there is a real tension between image and reality, a quiet hypocrisy in the contrast between the thrift the monarchy preached to its suffering subjects and the expensive obsessions the royal couple indulged behind the scenes. But the deeper cost of Mary's obsession was never financial at all, and this is where the honest reckoning with the bankruptcy claim leads to its most important truth. The real cost of Mary's collecting was ethical and human, paid not in the depletion of the royal collection, but in the coercion of the people she pressured, and in the integrity of how the crown acquired its treasures. The cost was borne by the aristocrats who surrendered their cherished objects, under the pressure of royal deference, who gave up treasures they wanted to keep because they could not bring themselves to refuse their queen. The cost was the corruption of the very idea of a gift, the transformation of free giving into coerced surrender, the laundering of a kind of taking into the appearance of generosity. The cost was the ethical murkiness of a collection built in part on objects, extracted through the soft coercion of royal position, the stain on the means by which some of the treasures were acquired. These were the real costs of Mary's obsession, and they were real. But they had nothing to do with bankrupting the royal collection and everything to do with the people and the principles that her hunger overrode. And now we come to the inversion that gives the whole bankruptcy claim its deepest irony, the truth that turns the sensational framing entirely on its head. Because there was in Mary's story a near bankruptcy, a real and consequential financial ruin that shaped everything about her. But it was not the royal collection that was nearly bankrupted. It was Mary's own family, the Tecks, who had run up debts they could not pay and fled the country to escape their creditors. The family whose financial collapse had marked Mary's childhood with the humiliation of genteel poverty. The near bankruptcy in Mary's life was the bankruptcy of her own origins, the ruin of the debt-ridden Teck household that had shaped her so profoundly, and her obsessive collecting was not the cause of any bankruptcy, but the consequence of one, the response of a woman who had grown up amid financial ruin and had spent her life accumulating the security and treasure that her impoverished childhood had lacked. Turn the claim over and see it clearly. The title says her obsession nearly bankrupted the royal collection. The truth is that a near bankruptcy nearly created her obsession, that the financial ruin of her family was the soil in which her hunger for treasure grew, that she collected so relentlessly precisely because she had known the precariousness of poverty and craved the security that beautiful and valuable objects represented. The bankruptcy was at the root of the obsession, not at its end. The Teck family's flight from its creditors, the humiliation of the poor relation, the lesson that money vanishes and security is fragile. These were the forces that made Mary the obsessive collector she became, the woman who surrounded herself with treasure as a hedge against the insecurity she had known. And the obsession that this near bankruptcy bred did not bankrupt the royal collection but enriched it, the impoverished girl becoming the great benefactor, the family ruin transmuted into the gathering of royal treasure. The whole logic of the title is inverted by the truth. The bankruptcy moved from effect to cause, from the collection to the family, from the consequence of Mary's obsession to its origin. This inversion is more than a clever reversal, because it points to the genuine heart of Mary's story, the psychological truth that runs beneath all the collecting and all the controversy. Mary collected because she had been poor and frightened and insecure, because her family had failed financially and fled in disgrace, because she had learned young that everything can be taken away. The treasures she gathered were her answer to that early insecurity, the security and permanence she had lacked, made tangible and possessable, the fortress of valuable objects she built against the remembered precariousness of her childhood. The obsession was not a queen's frivolous indulgence, but a wounded woman's response to early trauma, the accumulation of treasure as a way of holding off the insecurity that had marked her formative years. And understood this way, the obsession becomes not merely a controversy about coercive collecting, but a window onto a damaged psychology, the hunger of a woman who had known want and could never quite believe in her own security, who gathered and gathered against the fear that it might all vanish as her family's fortunes had vanished, as everything had vanished in the precarious world of her impoverished youth. There is, then, a sadness at the heart of Mary's obsession that the controversy over her coercive collecting can obscure, a poignancy in the spectacle of a woman gathering treasures to fill a void that no treasure could ever fill. The objects could provide security against financial loss, but they could not provide the deeper security that Mary lacked, the emotional security, the warmth and connection and love that her disciplined and suppressed character could neither give nor receive. And here the bankruptcy claim reaches its final and truest inversion, because the real bankruptcy in Mary's life, the deepest impoverishment, was not financial at all, and was not her family's, and was not the royal collections. It was her own emotional bankruptcy. the impoverishment of feeling that her rigid self-control had produced, the inability to love and connect that lay beneath all the gathering of treasure. The woman who enriched the royal collection so greatly impoverished herself in the things that matter most, and the treasures she accumulated were, in a sense, the substitute for the emotional riches she could neither give nor receive. This brings us to the human cost of Mary's obsession, the cost paid not by the royal collection, and not by the aristocrats she pressured, but by the people closest to her, by her own family, by the children she could love no better than she could love anyone, into whom she could not pour the warmth she poured into objects. The emotional bankruptcy that lay beneath her collecting had its victims, and they were her own sons and daughter, the children of a woman who could catalogue a collection but could not comfort a child, who could pursue a piece of jade with passion but could not embrace her own offspring with warmth. The obsession with objects and the failure of feeling were two faces of the same impoverished emotional life, and the failure of feeling did real damage to the people who most needed Mary's love. How that emotional bankruptcy expressed itself in her family, the cold and distant parenting, the tragedy of the children raised without warmth, and the particular sorrow of the son who was hidden away and died young, is where the story turns next. Because the deepest cost of Mary's obsession was the emotional impoverishment that lay beneath it, and that impoverishment was paid for, most painfully of all, by her own children, in a family where feeling had been so thoroughly suppressed that even a mother's love could not find its way to expression. That human cost, the emotional bankruptcy and its victims, is where we go now. The cruelest cost of Queen Mary's emotional impoverishment was paid in the nursery by the children she brought into the world and could not bring herself to warm, and it is here, in the failure of her mothering, that the sad logic of her whole character reaches its most painful expression. The woman who could pour passion into the pursuit of a jade carving could not pour love into her own children, and the gap between the two is the gap at the centre of Mary's tragedy. The displacement of feeling from people onto objects carried to its bitterest conclusion. Mary and George had 6 children, born across the years between 1894 and 1905. There was Edward, called David, in the family, the eldest, born in 1894, who would one day briefly be King Edward VIII before throwing his throne away. There was Albert, called Bertie, born in 1895, who would become King George VI after his brother's abdication, the reluctant and stammering second son thrust onto the throne he had never expected. There was Mary, the only daughter, the Princess Royal. There were Henry and George, the younger sons, who became the Dukes of Gloucester and Kent, and there was the youngest, John, born in 1905, whose short and sorrowful life would become the most painful chapter in the family's emotional history. 6 children, then, born to 2 of the most rigid and emotionally constrained parents in the kingdom, raised in a household where feeling was suppressed and duty was everything, and warmth was in tragically short supply. The parenting these children received was cold, distant and formal, and it left marks on all of them. George V, the father, was a stern and forbidding presence, a man who believed in discipline and obedience and the keeping of children firmly in their place, who could be harsh and intimidating with his sons, quick to criticize and slow to praise, a father whose displeasure the children learned to fear. There is a remark attributed to George, often repeated and capturing the spirit of his approach to fatherhood, even if its exact wording is uncertain, to the effect that his own father had frightened him, and that he was determined his children should be frightened of him in their turn. Whether or not he said precisely those words, the sentiment matches the reality of his parenting, the deliberate cultivation of fear and distance, the belief that children were best ruled through intimidation rather than warmth. George was a difficult and frightening father, and his children grew up in the shadow of his sternness, anxious to avoid his displeasure, starved of the easy affection that children need. And Mary, the mother, who might have softened her husband's harshness, who might have provided the warmth that George withheld, did not, because she could not. Her own rigid self-control, the suppression of feeling that she had cultivated since girlhood as a defense against her mother's chaos, left her unable to give her children the warmth and tenderness they needed. She deferred to her husband in matters of the children's upbringing, supported his sternness, rather than counterbalancing it, and brought to her own mothering the same emotional constraint that governed all her relationships. She loved her children in her way, but she could not express that love freely, could not embrace them with the spontaneous warmth that comes naturally to less guarded parents, could not be the source of comfort and affection that her husband's harshness made all the more necessary. The children had a stern and frightening father and a cold and distant mother, and between the two of them there was little of the warmth and security that a child's heart requires. The connection between Mary's failure as a mother and her obsession as a collector is one that the whole of her story has been building toward, and it must be stated plainly because it is the deepest truth about her. Mary could love objects and could not love people, or rather, could express her love for objects and could not express her love for people. The passion and devotion and tenderness that she lavished on her treasures, the ardor of the hunt and the joy of possession and the care of the collection, these were the feelings that her character permitted, directed safely at objects that made no emotional demands and posed no emotional risks. The same feelings, directed at her children, were locked away behind the armor of her self-control, unable to find expression, suppressed by the discipline that governed all her human relationships. The woman who could pursue a piece of Paul with passion could not embrace her son with warmth, because the porcelain was safe and the son was not, because loving an object required no vulnerability and loving a child required the openness of feeling that Mary had spent her life learning to suppress. The obsession with objects and the coldness toward people were two faces of the same displaced emotional life, the feeling flowing toward the things because it could not flow toward the people. This is a sad thing to contemplate, the spectacle of a woman so emotionally constrained that she could give her heart to her treasures, but not to her children, and it is sadder still when you consider the effect on the children themselves, who grew up sensing, as children always do, the warmth their parents could not provide. The royal children of George and Mary were raised in material splendor and emotional poverty, surrounded by every luxury and starved of the affection that matters more than any luxury, the heirs to an empire who lacked the simple warmth of loving parents, and the effects showed in their lives. The eldest, David, the future Edward VIII, grew into a man of profound emotional neediness, desperate for the love and attention he had not received as a child, and his desperate search for emotional fulfillment would lead him, in time, to the woman for whom he would throw away his throne. The second son, Bertie, the future George VI, developed a debilitating stammer, the kind of affliction that is often bound up with anxiety and emotional strain, the mark, perhaps, of a sensitive child raised in a frightening and unwarm household. The damage of the cold parenting rippled through the children's lives, shaping their characters and their struggles, the emotional poverty of their upbringing, leaving wounds that would never fully heal. But the most painful expression of the family's emotional coldness, the chapter that reveals most starkly the cost of Mary's constrained heart, was the story of the youngest child, Prince John, and it is a story that must be told with care, because it touches on illness and grief and the suppression of feeling at its most extreme. John was born in 1905, the last of the 6 children, and it became apparent as he grew that he was not like the others. He developed epilepsy, a condition that in that era was poorly understood and deeply stigmatized, surrounded by shame and fear and a desire to keep it hidden. As John's seizures grew more frequent and severe, and as his developmental differences became more apparent, the decision was made to remove him from the public life of the family, to keep him out of sight, to manage his condition away from the world's eyes. John was sent to live apart, established in a separate household on the Sandringham estate, cared for by his devoted nanny, Charlotte Bill, in a farmhouse away from the main family life. He was, in effect, hidden away, removed from the public view and from much of the family's daily existence, a child whose illness and difference made him an embarrassment to be concealed rather than a son to be openly cherished. He lived out his short life in this seclusion, cared for kindly enough by those immediately around him, but separated from the normal family life that his condition had made impossible in the eyes of his parents and the institution. And in 1919, at the age of just 13, John died, following a severe seizure, his brief and sequestered life coming to an end in the farmhouse, where he had been kept apart. The response to John's death, and the way it has been understood, reveals the family's emotional constraint at its most extreme and most contested. The conventional and harsher reading of the episode is that John was a child hidden away in shame, neglected by parents too rigid and too concerned with appearances to give an ill and different child the open love he deserved, and that his death was met with the same suppression of feeling that had governed his life. His parents too constrained to grieve him properly, too concerned with duty and dignity to mourn the loss of their youngest son with the open sorrow it warranted. In this reading, John is the ultimate victim of the family's emotional coldness, the child whose illness made him inconvenient and who was therefore removed and hidden, and when he died, insufficiently mourned, a small and sorrowful casualty of a household that could not deal with difference or express its grief. Honesty requires acknowledging that this harsh reading has been contested and complicated by historians, that the full truth of John's life and his family's feelings is more nuanced than the bleakest version allows. There is evidence that Mary did love John and did grieve his death, that she kept mementos of him, that his separation from the family was driven partly by genuine concern for his care and his safety as his condition worsened, that the decision to establish him in his own household reflected the medical understanding and the social attitudes of the time rather than simple heartlessness. Some accounts suggest that Mary visited John and cared about his welfare, that the seclusion was not pure abandonment but a response, however inadequate by modern standards, to the genuine difficulties of caring for a severely epileptic child in an era that had little understanding of the condition. The truth of John's life is not the simple story of a coldly abandoned child, and to present it as such would be to flatten a complex and painful history into a caricature. And yet, even granting the complications, even acknowledging that Mary loved John in her way and grieved him in her way, the episode remains a window onto the family's emotional constraint, because whatever love and grief Mary felt, she felt them within the prison of her suppressed character, expressed them, if at all, in the muted and controlled manner that her discipline permitted. The hiding away of John, even if driven partly by genuine concern, reflected a household and an institution for which appearances and dignity mattered enormously, for which an ill and different child was a difficulty to be managed discreetly rather than a sorrow to be borne openly. And the grief that Mary felt at his death, real as it may have been, was the grief of a woman who could not grieve openly, who suppressed her sorrow as she suppressed all her feelings, who mourned, like everything else, within the armour of her self-control. The story of John is not the simple story of a heartless mother, but it is the story of a family in which feeling was so constrained that even love and grief had to be hidden, in which an ill child was sequestered and a dead son was mourned in the muted and controlled manner that the family's emotional discipline demanded. The whole sorrowful history of Mary's mothering, then the cold parenting and the frightened children and the hidden and lost youngest son, is the human cost of the emotional bankruptcy that lay beneath her obsession with objects, and it is a cost that was paid by the people who most deserved her love. The feeling that flowed so freely toward her treasures could not flow toward her children, dammed up behind the self-control that governed her human relationships, and the children grew up in the emotional poverty that her constraint imposed, marked by it in ways that shaped their whole lives. The woman who enriched the royal collection impoverished her own family, gave to objects the warmth she could not give to people, built a magnificent collection on the foundation of an emotional life so suppressed that even a mother's love could barely find its way to expression. This is the deepest and most human cost of Mary's obsession, the price paid not in money or in the depletion of any collection but in the warmth, withheld from children who needed it, the emotional bankruptcy of a constrained heart visited upon the next generation. And this emotional constraint, this absolute suppression of feeling in the service of duty and dignity and the demands of the role, was not merely a personal failing, but the very principle by which Mary lived, the organizing conviction of her whole existence, that the self and its feelings must always be subordinated to the institution and its requirements. The coldness toward her children was of a piece with the whole of her character, the same suppression of self that made her the magnificent and forbidding queen, the same elevation of duty over feeling that governed every aspect of her life. To understand Mary fully, you have to see how completely she had subordinated herself to the institution, how thoroughly she had suppressed her own humanity in the service of the crown, and how this subordination, which made her so impressive as a queen, made her so impoverished as a human being. How that subordination of self to institution shaped the whole of Mary's life, how the suppression of feeling that starved her children was the same suppression that made her the perfect servant of the crown, and how her absolute devotion to the monarchy was both her greatest strength and the source of her deepest impoverishment, is where the story turns next. Because Mary's coldness was not random cruelty, but the expression of a worldview, a conviction that the institution came before the self, and that conviction would be tested, in the end, by the greatest crisis her family ever faced. That worldview, the subordination of self to crown, and the crisis that would test it, is where we go now. To grasp the whole of Queen Mary, you have to understand that her coldness and her collecting and her devotion to the crown were not three separate things, but three expressions of a single organizing principle, the conviction that the self must always be subordinated to the institution, that personal feeling counts for nothing against the demands of duty, and that the monarchy is a thing greater than any individual who serves it, to be upheld at whatever cost to one's own humanity. This was the creed by which Mary lived, the deepest truth of her character, and it explains the magnificent figure she presented to the world and the impoverished woman who lived behind it. The subordination of self to institution showed in everything about her, beginning with the rigid public persona that we have already glimpsed. The unvarying dignity, the frozen formality, the suppression of any spontaneous feeling, the magnificent and forbidding mask of the queen, all of this was the self subordinated to the role, the personal feeling sacrificed to the demands of the institution. Mary did not present herself to the world as a person. She presented herself as a queen, an embodiment of the monarchy, a figure who had submerged her own individuality into the role she performed. The famous toque hats and the upright posture and the parasol and the jewels were not the expressions of a personal style, but the costume of an institution, the uniform of a woman who had become, in her public self, a kind of living symbol of the crown, rather than a human being with feelings of her own. She had made herself into a monument, and the monument was magnificent, and behind it the woman had all but disappeared. The same subordination governed her absolute devotion to the continuity and dignity of the monarchy, the cause to which she gave her entire life. Mary revered the institution that had saved her with a devotion that went beyond loyalty into something close to worship, a conviction that the monarchy was a sacred thing, the embodiment of the nation's history and continuity, a trust to be guarded and preserved and passed on undiminished to future generations. This devotion was rooted, as we have seen, in her own history, in the fact that the crown had reached down and lifted her out of the precariousness of her family's failure, had given her a life of security and grandeur she could never have had without it. She owed the institution everything, and she repaid the debt with a lifetime of service so complete that it left no room for the self, a devotion to the monarchy that subordinated her own happiness and her own feelings and her own humanity to the cause of upholding the crown. And here the connection to her collecting becomes fully clear. Because Mary's obsession with royal treasure was, at its deepest level, an expression of this same devotion to the institution, the gathering of the dynasty's treasures as a form of service to the monarchy she revered, the recovery of lost royal relics, the consolidation of the scattered heritage of the crown, the building up of the royal collection, all of this was, for Mary, a way of strengthening and honouring and preserving the institution to which she had given her life. The objects embodied the continuity and the legitimacy of the dynasty, and to gather and preserve them was to serve the monarchy's permanence, to repair the damage of past dispersals, to ensure that the treasures that represented the crown's endurance were brought together and protected for the future. The collecting was not separate from her devotion to the institution. It was an expression of it, the same loyalty that made her subordinate herself to the role directing her, in another channel, to gather and preserve the treasures that embodied the institution's continuity. The woman who gave her humanity to the crown gave her passion to the crown's treasures, and the two devotions were aspects of the same all-consuming loyalty. The psychology that underlay all of this, the deep structure of Mary's character, was a psychology of control and security and the suppression of risk, and it bound together the emotional coldness and the obsessive collecting and the devotion to the institution into a single coherent whole. At the root of Mary's character was the need for control, the need to order and manage and contain a world that her early experience had taught her was dangerous and precarious. She controlled her own feelings, suppressing them behind the armor of her self-discipline. She controlled her possessions, gathering and ordering and arranging her treasures into a collection she could survey and command. And she found, in the institution of monarchy, the ultimate source of order and permanence and security, a thing larger and more enduring than any individual, to which she could subordinate herself, and in whose continuity she could find the stability her own precarious origins had lacked. The suppression of feeling, the obsessive collecting, the devotion to the crown, all of it served the same deep need, the need for control and security against the chaos and precariousness that Mary had learned, in her impoverished and humiliated childhood, to fear above all things. This is why the emotionally suppressed woman and the obsessive collector and the devoted servant of the crown were one and the same person, why you cannot separate the coldness from the collecting from the devotion. They were all expressions of a single psychology, the psychology of a woman who needed to control and order and secure her world against the insecurity she had known, who found in the suppression of feeling and the gathering of treasure and the service of the institution three channels for the same fundamental drive. The objects she collected, the feelings she suppressed, the institution she served, all of these were ways of building order and permanence and security, of holding off the chaos, of constructing a controlled and stable world in place of the precarious one she had been born into. Mary's whole life was, in a sense, a vast project of control, an attempt to order and secure and stabilize her existence against the insecurity of her origins, and the collecting and the coldness and the devotion were all parts of that project, all expressions of the same deep need for control that her early trauma had bred. And the tragedy of this psychology of control is that it succeeded in everything except the things that matter most. Mary achieved the security she craved, the grandeur and the permanence and the stability of her position as queen, the magnificent collection that embodied the order she sought to impose on the world. She succeeded in subordinating herself to the institution, in becoming the perfect servant of the crown, in suppressing her feelings so completely that she presented to the world a figure of flawless and forbidding control. She gathered her treasures and ordered her collection and served her institution with a dedication that achieved everything she set out to achieve. But the control that succeeded in all of this failed in the one domain where control is not the answer, the domain of human relationships, of love and warmth and connection, which cannot be controlled or ordered or secured, but can only be given freely, with the openness and the vulnerability that Mary's whole character was designed to prevent. She controlled everything she could control, and in controlling it, she lost the things that cannot be controlled. The warmth she could not give her children, the love she could not freely express, the human connection that her need for control had made impossible. The project of control succeeded, and the success was a kind of failure, the achievement of security at the cost of the warmth and connection that no security can replace. There is, in this, a poignancy that runs beneath all the grandeur and all the controversy of Mary's life, the poignancy of a woman who built a fortress of control and security and treasure and found herself, inside the fortress alone. The magnificent queen, the great collector, the devoted servant of the crown, was also a woman who had subordinated her own humanity so completely to the demands of control and duty and institution that she had lost the capacity for the warmth and connection that make a life rich in the ways that matter most. She had everything the world could give, the grandeur and the treasure and the security, and she lacked the things that cannot be gathered or controlled or commanded, the freely given love, the open warmth, the human connection that her psychology of control had foreclosed. The fortress kept out the chaos and the precariousness she feared, and it kept out as well the warmth and the love she needed, and inside it Mary lived a life of magnificent and impoverished control. secure against everything except her own loneliness. This psychology of absolute devotion to the institution, of the subordination of self and feeling to the demands of the crown, would face its supreme test in the greatest crisis the family ever knew, the crisis that erupted at the very end of Mary's husband's life, and in the first year of her widowhood, when one of her own children would place his personal happiness above his duty to the institution and force Mary to choose, in the starkest possible terms, between her love for her son and her devotion to the crown. The crisis was the abdication, the throwing away of a throne for love, and it would reveal, more clearly than anything else in her life, exactly where Mary's deepest loyalties lay, and exactly how completely she had subordinated everything, even her feeling for her own child, to the institution she served. How the abdication crisis tested Mary's deepest values, how she responded when her son chose love over duty, and what her response revealed about the absolute priority she gave to the institution over every personal feeling, even a mother's love, is where the story turns next. Because the abdication was the moment when Mary's whole creed, the subordination of self to crown, was put to its hardest test, and her response would show, with brutal clarity, that for Mary the institution truly did come before everything, even before her own son. That supreme test of her values, the abdication, and her response to it, is where we go now. The greatest crisis of Mary's life came in 1936, the year that began with the death of her husband and ended with the abdication of her son, and it would test her deepest values in the most brutal way imaginable, forcing her to choose, in the starkest terms, between her love for a child and her devotion to the institution she had served all her life. It was the year that revealed, more clearly than anything else, exactly where Mary's loyalties truly lay, and the revelation was as impressive and as chilling as the woman herself. The year opened in mourning. In January 1936, King George V died, ending the marriage of 43 years that had begun as a dynastic arrangement and grown into a genuine partnership of two reserved and dutiful people. Mary, now 68 years old, became a widow, and with George's death she ceased to be queen and became the Queen Mother, the Dowager, the matriarch of the family rather than its reigning consort. Her eldest son, David, the future she had helped to raise in such emotional poverty, became King Edward VIII, ascending to the throne that Mary regarded as a sacred trust, and almost immediately the new reign began to move toward the catastrophe that would define it, because David had brought to the throne the one thing that Mary's whole creed could not accommodate, a determination to place his personal happiness above his duty to the crown. The source of the crisis was a woman, Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee with whom David was deeply, helplessly in love. She was twice divorced, her first husband still living, her second marriage in the process of ending, and she was, by every standard that the institution and the church and the establishment applied, entirely unsuitable to be the wife of the King and Queen of England. The King was the supreme governor of the Church of England, a church that did not permit the remarriage of divorced people while their former spouses lived, and for David to marry Wallis would set the head of the church in direct conflict with the church's own teaching. Beyond the religious objection lay the whole weight of establishment opinion, the conviction that a twice-divorced American was an impossible queen, that the marriage would damage the monarchy, that the king's duty required him to give up the woman rather than the throne. The crisis built through 1936 as David made clear that he would not give up Wallis, that he intended to marry her whatever the cost, that he would place his love for this woman above every consideration of duty and institution and the advice of everyone around him. For Mary, this was not merely a constitutional crisis or a family difficulty. It was the violation of everything she believed in, the negation of the entire creed by which she had lived her life. Mary had subordinated everything to the institution, had suppressed her own feelings, and sacrificed her own happiness, and given her whole self to the service of the crown, had built her life around the conviction that duty came before personal desire, and that the monarchy was a sacred trust to be upheld at any cost, the self. And now her own son, the king, was doing the precise opposite, placing his personal desire above his duty, threatening the institution for the sake of his own happiness, throwing away the sacred trust for the love of a woman. David's choice was the repudiation of Mary's entire worldview, the elevation of exactly the personal feeling that Mary had spent her life suppressing over exactly the institutional duty that Mary had spent her life serving. To a woman of Mary's convictions, it was not just a mistake. It was a betrayal of the crown and of duty, and of everything she held sacred. Mary's response to the crisis revealed the absolute priority she gave to the institution, and it was a response of implacable opposition and chilling coldness toward her own son. She did not sympathize with David's desire to marry the woman he loved. She did not, as a mother might, take her son's side, or seek a compromise that would allow him his happiness, or place her love for her child above the demands of the institution. She came down, completely and immovably, on the side of the crown. She regarded David's determination to marry Wallace as an abdication of his duty, a betrayal of the institution, a selfish elevation of personal desire over sacred obligation, and she opposed it with the full force of her conviction. There was no maternal softening, no taking of the son's part, no willingness to put his happiness before the institution's needs. For Mary, the institution came first, absolutely and without exception, even when the choice was between the institution and her own child, and she made that choice without apparent hesitation, siding with the crown against her son. The crisis came to its head in December 1936 when David, refusing to give up Wallace and unable to marry her and remain king, abdicated the throne. He gave up the crown, signed the instrument of abdication, and left the country to marry the woman he loved, becoming the Duke of Windsor, an exile from the institution he had briefly headed. The throne passed to his reluctant younger brother, Bertie, who became King George VI, the stammering second son thrust into the role he had never wanted and never expected. And Mary, the matriarch, the widow, the embodiment of the institution's values, watched her eldest son throw away his throne for love, and her response was not the grief of a mother whose child had sacrificed everything for happiness, but the cold disapproval of a woman whose deepest values had been betrayed. Mary's coldness toward David over the abdication was real and lasting, and it reveals the chilling completeness of her subordination of feeling to institution. She regarded what he had done as unforgivable, a betrayal of duty that she could not accept or condone, and her attitude toward him afterward was marked by a coldness that never fully thawed. She did not embrace the woman he had given up everything to marry, never accepting Wallace, never warming to the marriage that had cost the institution so much. She made clear, in her controlled and forbidding way, her disapproval of what David had done, her conviction that he had failed in his sacred duty, her judgment that the throwing away of the throne for personal happiness was a betrayal of everything the monarchy stood for. The mother who might have comforted her son in his exile, who might have understood his desperate need for the love he had been denied as a child, who might have placed her feeling for her own offspring above her devotion to the institution, did none of these things. She sided with the crown, judged her son and found him wanting, and maintained toward him a coldness that expressed, more clearly than any words, the absolute priority she gave to the institution over even her own child. There is something genuinely chilling in this, and it is worth sitting with, because it reveals the dark side of Mary's magnificent devotion. The same subordination of self to institution that made her so impressive as a queen, the same elevation of duty over feeling that made her the perfect servant of the crown, made her capable of turning against her own son when he placed his happiness above his duty, of judging him and finding him wanting and maintaining toward him a coldness born of her conviction that the institution must always come first. Her devotion to the crown was so complete that it overrode even a mother's love, so absolute that she could side with the institution against her own child without apparent hesitation. This is the dark face of the creed that organized her whole life. The subordination of self to institution carried to the point where it could turn a mother against her son, where it could make the demands of the crown trump the bonds of family, where it could produce a coldness toward one's own child in the name of duty to an institution. Mary's devotion was magnificent, and it was also, in this expression, frightening. The elevation of the institution above the human to the point where even maternal love was sacrificed to it. The connection between Mary's response to the abdication and the whole of her character, including her collecting, is one that illuminates the deepest truth about her. The same psychology that made her subordinate her son to the institution made her subordinate her own feelings to her self-control, made her gather and order and preserve the treasures of the crown, made her serve the monarchy with a devotion that left no room for the self. The abdication revealed, in the starkest terms, what Mary's whole life had been built on: the absolute priority of the institution over the personal, the conviction that duty trumps feeling, and that the crown comes before everything, even before one's own child. And this same conviction ran through her collecting, through her devotion to the recovery and preservation of the dynasty's treasures, through her whole understanding of herself as a servant of an institution greater than any individual. The woman who could turn against her son for the sake of the crown was the same woman who could gather treasures for the crown's glory and suppress her feelings for the crown's dignity, the institution always first, the self and its bonds always subordinated to the larger thing she served. After the abdication, Mary rallied behind the new king, her son Bertie, now George VI, supporting him in the difficult task of restoring the stability and dignity of the monarchy after the upheaval David had caused. She lent her formidable presence and her unimpeachable devotion to the work of steadying the institution, of demonstrating its continuity and its endurance through the crisis, of showing that the monarchy was greater than any individual king and would survive the abdication of one of them. Her support for George VI was the natural expression of her devotion to the institution, the matriarch standing behind the new king in the service of the crown's continuity, helping to repair the damage and restore the dignity that the abdication had threatened. And in this too, she was true to her creed, giving her support not out of personal preference, but out of devotion to the institution, serving the new king because he was the king, upholding the monarchy through the crisis as she had upheld it all her life. The abdication, then, was the supreme test of Mary's values, and she passed it, if passing is the word, with a completeness that was both impressive and chilling. She placed the institution above her son, duty above love, the crown above the bonds of family, and in doing so she revealed the absolute priority that the institution held in her life, the completeness with which she had subordinated everything, even her own child, to the monarchy she served. It was the fullest expression of the creed by which she had lived, the subordination of self to institution carried to its furthest and coldest extreme, and it showed, more clearly than anything else, the kind of woman that the psychology of control and devotion and suppression had made her, a woman magnificent in her loyalty to the crown and frightening in the coldness that loyalty could produce. This was the woman in her final phase, the matriarch who had given everything to the institution, who had buried her husband and weathered the abdication of one son, and lent her support to another who had subordinated her whole life to the monarchy she revered. She had a decade and a half still to live after the abdication, years that would see another world war and the further transformation of the world she had been born into, years in which she remained the magnificent and forbidding embodiment of an older idea of monarchy, the grand old lady of the royal family, the last great link to the vanished age of Victoria and Edward. And as her long life drew toward its close, the meaning of the whole of it, the obsession and the coldness and the devotion, would come into its final focus, the full reckoning of what Mary of Teck had been, and what her life had cost, and what it had been for. How Mary's final years unfolded, how she met her death, and what the whole of her extraordinary life finally reveals about the obsession that defined her, the institution she served, and the human cost of the devotion she gave, is where the story comes to its close. Because the time has come for the final reckoning, the honest verdict on the woman who saved the royal collection and impoverished her own heart, who gathered treasure against the insecurity of her childhood and gave to objects the love she could not give to people, who served the crown with a devotion so complete that it consumed her humanity. That final reckoning, the verdict on the whole of her life, is where we go now. There is a document from the aftermath that has come to stand, fairly or not, as the distilled essence of Mary's attitude, a letter she wrote to David sometime after the abdication, in which she set down her view of what he had done. In it, she made plain that she could not understand his choice, that she regarded his willingness to give up the throne, what she called his high and sacred trust, as something close to incomprehensible, a sacrifice of duty to personal feeling that violated her deepest sense of what a monarch owed to the institution and the nation. The thing that wounded her, she made clear, was not merely the marriage or the woman, but the abandonment of duty itself, the placing of the self above the crown, the failure to subordinate personal desire to sacred obligation. To David, who had spent his whole life starved of the warmth his parents could not give, who had grown into a man desperate for the love he had been denied, the letter must have read as the final confirmation of everything he had always felt about his mother: that she could understand duty but not love, that she could grasp obligation but not the human need that had driven him to throw everything away. The tragedy of the exchange is that both of them were, in a sense, the products of the same emotional poverty. David's desperate hunger for love and Mary's incomprehension of it were two outcomes of the same cold household: the son who needed love above all things, and the mother who had so thoroughly suppressed her own capacity for it that she could not understand a man who would sacrifice a throne to obtain it. It is worth dwelling on the cruelty of the position David found himself in, not to excuse the genuine damage his abdication did to the institution, but to see the human dimension that Mary's creed could not accommodate. Here was a man who had been raised without warmth by a frightening father and a constrained mother, in a household where feeling was suppressed and duty was everything, and who had grown into adulthood carrying the unmet emotional needs of that loveless childhood. And here was that same man, finding at last in Wallace Simpson the love and the emotional fulfillment he had never known, unwilling to give it up even for a throne, choosing the warmth he had been denied over the duty he had been raised to serve. There is a terrible logic in it, a sense in which David's abdication was the direct consequence of the emotional poverty of his upbringing. The starved child grown into a man who would sacrifice anything for the love he had never received. And Mary, who had helped to create that emotional poverty through her own coldness, could not see her son's choice as anything but a betrayal, could not recognize in his desperate need for love the consequence of the warmth she had failed to give him. The mother who had withheld love judged the son who could not live without it, and neither of them could bridge the gulf between them, the gulf that the cold household of their shared past had created. The contrast between her treatment of her two sons in this period is itself revealing, and it underscores the conditional nature of the regard Mary gave her children, a regard that flowed toward duty and away from its abandonment. Toward David, who had failed in his duty, she was cold, judging, unforgiving, her disapproval a permanent feature of their relationship from the abdication onward. Toward Bertie, who had accepted the duty his brother had thrown away, who had taken up the crown he had never wanted out of obligation rather than desire, she was supportive, approving, ready to lend her formidable presence to his cause. The difference between her attitudes toward the two sons was the difference between the son who had served the institution and the son who had betrayed it, and it shows that Mary's regard for her children was bound up, even at this level, with their fulfillment of duty, that her approval was something earned by service to the institution, rather than something given freely as a mother's love. Bertie had done his duty, and so he had his mother's support. David had failed in his, and so he had her coldness. Even in her relationships with her own children, the institution was the measure, duty the criterion, the crown, the thing that determined where her regard would flow. And there was a heavy irony in the burden that now fell on Bertie, the reluctant new king, because he was in many ways the least equipped of the brothers to bear it, the sensitive second son with the debilitating stammer, the very affliction that had been bred, at least in part, by the anxious and unwarm household of his childhood. The cold parenting that Mary and George had given their children had marked Bertie with the stammer that made public speaking an agony for him, and now that same Bertie, so wounded by his upbringing, was being called upon to take up the most public role in the kingdom, to be the king who would speak to the nation and embody the institution and restore its dignity after the abdication. The damage of the cold household had come full circle in the cruelest way. The stammering son of the unwarm parents, now king, forced to overcome the affliction his childhood had given him in order to serve the institution his mother revered. That Bertie rose to the challenge, that he became, as George VI, a respected and steadying monarch who held the institution together through the Second World War, is a tribute to his own courage and to the support of his wife, and to the speech therapy that helped him master his stammer. But the burden he carried was, in part, the legacy of the emotional poverty that Mary and George had inflicted on their children, and there is a bitter symmetry in the fact that the institution Mary served so devotedly was now to be embodied by the son whose struggles were, in some measure, the product of her own coldness. The last great chapter of Queen Mary's life began with another war, and it revealed, even in her old age, that the character forged in her impoverished childhood had never changed, that the woman of 72 who left London in 1939 was the same woman of control and order and restless activity she had always been. When the Second World War came and the German bombers began to fall on London, Mary was persuaded to leave the capital for the safety of the countryside, and she went to Badminton House in Gloucestershire, the home of the Duke of Beaufort, whose wife was Mary's niece. There, in the rural quiet of wartime England, the magnificent and forbidding Queen Mother spent the war years, and her conduct in that strange interlude tells you everything about the energy and the eccentricity and the need for control that had driven her all her life. Mary did not pass the war in stately idleness. She threw herself into activity with the same relentless energy she had brought to her collecting, and she found her great wartime crusade in the most unexpected of objects. She declared war on ivy. For reasons that seemed to have combined a genuine wish to be useful with the sheer need to be doing something, Mary led working parties across the Badminton estate to clear ivy and undergrowth from the trees and the buildings, attacking the offending greenery with an enthusiasm that sometimes outran her judgment, occasionally stripping away plants that the gardeners would rather have kept. She collected scrap metal for the war effort, gathering up old iron and useful materials with the zeal of a woman who could not bear to leave anything unproductive. She ordered her car to stop for any servicemen she saw walking, giving lifts to soldiers and airmen who found themselves, to their astonishment, riding through the Gloucestershire lanes with the Queen Mother. She was in these years an eccentric and energetic and rather wonderful figure. The old Queen turned wartime force of nature, throwing her formidable will into the small useful tasks of a country at war. There is something revealing in this wartime energy, in the way Mary, even at 72, and in the strangeness of evacuation, could not stop ordering and clearing and gathering and organizing. It was the same need for control and activity that had driven her collecting, the same restless will to impose order on the world around her, the same inability to sit still while there was something to be done. The woman who had spent her life gathering treasures and ordering collections now gathered scrap and cleared ivy, the underlying drive unchanged, the need for control and productive activity, finding new objects in the conditions of war. The Badminton years show Mary's character stripped of its grandeur and reduced to its essence, the energy and the order and the restless will that had always been there, expressed now in the homely tasks of wartime rather than in the gathering of royal treasure, but recognizably the same. The war years also brought Mary the kind of loss that had punctuated her whole life, the loss of a child, born with the same iron control that governed everything she did. In August 1942, her son Prince George, the Duke of Kent, was killed when the military aircraft carrying him crashed in Scotland, dead at 39 in the service of the war. It was a devastating blow, the loss of a son in the prime of his life, and Mary met it as she met everything, with a suppression of feeling so complete that it became its own kind of monument. She did not break down. She did not let her grief overwhelm her dignity or her duty. She bore the loss with the granite composure that had always been her armor, mourning her son within the prison of her self-control, the feeling suppressed and contained and held rigidly in check even in the face of a mother's worst sorrow. This was not the first child Mary had lost, and it would not be the only loss of her later years. She had buried her youngest, Prince John, back in 1919, the epileptic child who had lived and died apart. She lost the Duke of Kent in 1942, and in February 1952, near the very end of her own life, she lost another son, and this one was a king. George VI, the reluctant monarch, who had taken up the throne his brother had thrown away, who had held the institution together through the war, died at the age of 56, worn out by the burdens of a crown he had never wanted, and Mary, now 84, outlived a second reigning son, having already seen one son abdicate and another die. 3 of her 6 children predeceased her, John and the Duke of Kent and George VI, and she bore each loss with the same suppressed and stoic control, the same refusal to let grief breach the armor of her dignity. There is a terrible quality to this accumulation of born sorrow, the spectacle of a woman absorbing loss after loss, with a composure so complete that the feeling never showed, the grief locked away with everything else behind the iron self-control that had governed her whole life. She felt these losses, surely, as deeply as any mother feels the death of her children, but she could not show what she felt, could not let the sorrow find expression, could only contain it within the discipline that had defined her, mourning her dead children in the silent and rigid manner that her suppressed character permitted. The death of George VI in 1952 brought Mary's granddaughter to the throne, the young Princess Elizabeth becoming Queen Elizabeth II, and it placed Mary in the position of matriarch to a new reign, the last great link between the new young queen and the vanished world of Victoria and Edward, in which Mary herself had been formed. She had been born in 1867, in the reign of Queen Victoria, when the British Empire was at its height and the old certainties of monarchy seemed eternal. She had lived through the reigns of Victoria, Edward VII, her own husband George V, her son Edward VIII, her son George VI, and now into the reign of her granddaughter Elizabeth II, an arc of history that spanned the whole transformation of the modern world, from the age of empire to the age that followed it. She was a living relic of an older idea of monarchy, the magnificent and forbidding grand old lady who carried into the middle of the 20th century the bearing and the values of a vanished age, and as her granddaughter prepared to be crowned, Mary stood as the last great representative of the world that had made her. And then, in the manner that was entirely characteristic of her, Mary used even her own death to serve the institution she had given her life to. She was failing by early 1953, 85 years old, her long life drawing toward its close, and she knew that her death might fall close to the coronation of her granddaughter, scheduled for June. The coronation of a new monarch is normally surrounded by elaborate protocols, including the possibility of postponement for court mourning if a senior royal dies. And Mary, contemplating her own approaching death, gave instructions that captured the whole of her creed in a single final gesture. She let it be known that if she should die before the coronation, the great ceremony was not to be postponed on her account. The crowning of the new queen was not to be delayed by mourning for the old queen mother. The institution was to proceed, the coronation to go ahead as planned, the continuity of the monarchy not to be interrupted by the death of one woman, even if that woman was Mary herself. Consider what this final instruction reveals, because it is the perfect distillation of everything Mary had been. Even in death, even in the contemplation of her own ending, she subordinated herself to the institution. She would not let her death inconvenience the crown, would not allow her own mortality to interrupt the great ceremony of the monarchy's continuity, would not put her own significance above the smooth functioning of the institution she served. The self, even the dying self, even the dead self, must give way to the institution. The coronation must proceed. The monarchy must go on. Mary's death was to be no more than a private matter that would not be permitted to disturb the public continuity of the crown. It was the last expression of the creed by which she had lived. The subordination of self to institution carried all the way to the grave, the woman who had given her whole life to the monarchy, ensuring that even her death would serve its continuity rather than interrupt it. Mary died on the 24th of March 1953 at Marlborough House in London, 85 years old, the great matriarch gone at last, after a life that had spanned the whole transformation of the modern world. She died about 10 weeks before her granddaughter's coronation, and in accordance with her wishes, the coronation was not postponed. On the 2nd of June 1953, Elizabeth II was crowned in Westminster Abbey, the great ceremony proceeding as planned, the continuity of the monarchy unbroken, exactly as Mary had wished. She did not live to see the crowning of her granddaughter, the new young queen who would reign for 70 years and become the longest reigning monarch in British history. But she had ensured that the ceremony would go ahead, that her death would not interrupt the institution's great moment, that the monarchy would continue without pause. It was, in its way, A fitting end for a woman who had given everything to the crown, the final subordination of the self to the institution, the last service of a lifetime of service. So ended the long and extraordinary life of Mary of Teck, the poor relation who became queen, the impoverished girl who became one of the greatest collectors in royal history, the woman of suppressed feeling who served the institution with a devotion that consumed her humanity. And with her life laid out before us in full, the time has come for the final reckoning, for the honest verdict on the obsession that defined her, and the question that this whole story began with, the question of whether her hunger for treasure nearly bankrupted the royal collection. The verdict on that question is clear, and it must be stated without equivocation, because the truth matters more than the sensational framing. Mary did not bankrupt the royal collection. She saved it. She is counted among the small handful of people who built it into the magnificent thing it is, named alongside the greatest royal collectors of history, regarded by the institution itself as one of its supreme benefactors. She recovered the lost treasures of her dynasty, reversing the dispersals of careless and desperate ancestors, hunting down the scattered relics of the crown and bringing them home. She consolidated the collection, gathering together what had drifted apart, ordering the chaos, documenting and cataloguing and researching with a scholarship that no previous royal collector had matched. She added to the collection on a substantial scale, swelling its holdings with treasures that remain in royal hands to this day. The royal collection as it now exists, the glittering assemblage in the palaces, is richer and more coherent and better understood because of Mary, and the claim that she nearly bankrupted it is the precise inversion of the truth. She did not drain the collection, she filled it. And yet the honest verdict cannot rest there, with Mary simply celebrated as a benefactor, because the darker truth runs alongside the admirable one and cannot be separated from it. The same obsession that saved the royal collection had a coercive shadow that was real and that her contemporaries understood, the soft coercion of the pointed admiration that extracted treasures from owners who could not bring themselves to refuse their queen. Mary acquired some of her treasures through a pressure that made refusal nearly impossible, through the weaponization of royal deference, through the simple devastating fact that no one in her world could comfortably say no to a sovereign. The gifts that flowed toward her were not always freely given. Many were surrendered under a social pressure that transformed admiration into a kind of taking, that turned the queen's wish into something close to a command, that built her collection in part out of objects extracted rather than offered. The connoisseur who saved the collection was also the coercer who could not be refused, and both faces were real, the achievement and the offense flowing from the same relentless hunger. This is the honest verdict on Mary's collecting, the holding together of two truths that the simpler stories try to separate. She was not the woman who bankrupted the royal collection, the sensational villain of the title, and she was not merely the noble connoisseur of the institution's flattering version, the great benefactor whose collecting was entirely admirable. She was both the savior and the coercer, the woman who enriched the collection through genuine scholarship and devotion, and who also acquired, through a soft coercion that her royal position made possible, the achievement and the shadow inseparable, two expressions of the same obsessive hunger for treasure. To see her clearly is to refuse both the lurid legend and the flattering whitewash, to hold the admirable and the troubling together, to recognize that the same drive produced both the rescue of the dynasty's heritage and the emptying of the aristocracy's drawing rooms. But the deepest significance of Mary's collecting lies beyond even this complex verdict, in what her acquisitiveness reveals about the nature of royal power itself. And here the story opens onto something larger than one woman's obsession, because Mary's collecting is in the end a study in how power operates in its softest and most insidious forms, in how the powerful get what they want without ever appearing to take anything at all. There was no theft, no force, no crude compulsion in Mary's acquisitions. There was only the quiet, pervasive, irresistible pressure of royal position, the way the wish of a queen becomes a command, the way deference transforms admiration into surrender, the way a sovereign can extract treasures through the simple impossibility of refusing her. This is power at its most refined, the power that operates through social pressure and the impossibility of saying no rather than through any overt coercion, and Mary's collecting reveals it with unusual clarity. The soft extraction by which royalty accumulates what it desires while maintaining the fiction that everyone involved is acting freely. The deepest point is this, that the glittering treasures of the crown, the magnificent collections that fill the royal palaces and dazzle the visitors and represent the splendor of the monarchy, rest in part on exactly this kind of soft coercion, this extraction of beauty through the pressure of position. The objects that flowed toward Mary were, in the official telling, gifts freely given to a beloved queen, generous offerings to the crown. In the truer telling, many of them were treasures surrendered under a pressure that made refusal impossible, extracted by the exploitation of royal deference, given because they could not be withheld. And this gap between the official telling and the truer one is the gap between how royal power describes itself and how royal power actually works. The monarchy presents its treasures as the fruits of legitimate collecting and generous gift-giving, and behind that presentation lies, at least in part, the soft coercion by which a sovereign extracts what she wants, the laundering of a kind of taking into the appearance of generosity. The treasures still glitter in the palaces today, admired by millions, and the hidden history of how some of them were acquired, the soft coercion and the impossibility of refusing a queen, is written nowhere on the labels, but is part of the truth of how the great collection came to be. This is the takedown that the genteel reputation of the Magpie Queen conceals. The uncomfortable truth about how the crown's splendor is partly built, the recognition that royal power turns admiration into extraction and dresses the taking up as a gift. Mary did not invent this dynamic, and she was not the only royal collector to benefit from it, but she expressed it with unusual purity. The soft coercion of royalty, operating through her relentless hunger for treasure, the gathering of beauty through the simple fact that no one can refuse a sovereign. And the lesson of her collecting reaches beyond her own case, to the nature of the institution itself, to the way the monarchy accumulates, and the way that accumulation rests on a power that need never announce itself, that operates through deference and social pressure, and the impossibility of saying no, that gets its way while maintaining the appearance that everyone is acting freely. The treasures of the crown are real and magnificent, and the means by which some of them were gathered are less magnificent than the treasures themselves, and the gap between the two is the gap that Mary's collecting exposes. But the most human verdict on Mary's life, the truest and the saddest, lies not in the controversy over her collecting, but in what the obsession reveals about the woman herself, about the emotional life that the gathering of treasure expressed and concealed. Because Mary's obsession with objects was, at its deepest level, the displacement of a feeling that could find no other outlet, the channeling of a love that her suppressed character could not direct at people, into the safe and undemanding objects that made no emotional claims. She could love a piece of jade with a passion she could not show her children. She could pursue a treasure with an ardor she could not bring to a human relationship. She could pour into her collection the warmth and devotion and feeling that her rigid self-control locked away in every other part of her life. The objects were where Mary kept her heart, the acceptable recipients of an emotion that her discipline forbade her to express to the people who most needed it, and the very intensity of her obsession is the measure of how much feeling had been dammed up behind her armor, how completely the love that should have flowed toward people had been redirected onto things. And this displacement had its victims, and they were the people closest to her, the family who needed her warmth and received instead the coldness of her suppressed heart. Her children grew up in emotional poverty, raised by a frightening father and a distant mother, starved of the affection that matters more than any luxury, marked for life by the warmth they did not receive. The eldest, David, grew into a man so desperate for the love he had been denied that he threw away a throne to obtain it. The second son, Bertie, carried the stammer that the anxious and unwarm household had helped to breed. The youngest, John, lived and died apart, the ill child who could not be openly cherished. The family bore the cost of Mary's emotional bankruptcy, paid the price of a mother who could love objects, but not people, who gave to her treasures the warmth she withheld from her children. The obsession that enriched the royal collection impoverished her own family and the impoverishment was the deepest and most human cost of the whole of her collecting. The warmth withheld from the people who needed it most, redirected onto the objects that needed nothing at all. The fortress that Mary built, the fortress of control and order and treasure and devotion to the institution, kept out the chaos and the precariousness she had feared since her impoverished childhood, and it kept out, as well, the warmth and the love and the human connection that her psychology of control had foreclosed. She had everything the world could give, the grandeur and the security and the magnificent collection, and she lacked the things that cannot be gathered or controlled, the freely given love, the open warmth, the connection that her armor prevented. Inside the fortress she had built against insecurity, Mary lived a life of magnificent and impoverished control, secure against everything except the loneliness that her own suppression had created. The success of her project of control was a kind of failure. The achievement of security at the cost of the warmth that no security can replace, the building of a fortress that protected her from the chaos and imprisoned her in solitude. The whole of it traces back, in the end, to the impoverished and humiliated childhood that shaped her, to the family that had failed financially and fled its creditors, to the lesson that money vanishes and status is fragile and everything can be taken away. Mary collected because she had been poor and frightened and insecure, gathering treasure against the precariousness she had known, building a hedge of valuable and permanent objects against the insecurity of her origins. She suppressed her feelings because she had learned, watching her chaotic and undisciplined mother, that the way to safety was through control rather than emotion, through the ordering and managing of a dangerous world. She served the institution because the crown had reached down and rescued her from the failure of her family, and she repaid the debt with a devotion that consumed her humanity. The collecting and the coldness and the devotion all flowed from the same source, the same wounded psychology of a woman who had known want and humiliation, and had spent her life building the security and control and order that her childhood had lacked. The obsession was not a queen's frivolous indulgence, but a damaged woman's response to early trauma, and to understand it is to understand the sads at the heart of one of the most magnificent and forbidding figures ever to wear a crown. This brings the whole story to its final and truest inversion, the inversion that turns the title's claim entirely on its head and reveals the deepest meaning of Mary's life. The title says her obsession nearly bankrupted the royal collection. The truth is that there was indeed a bankruptcy in Mary's story, a real and devastating impoverishment, but it was never financial, and it was never the royal collections. The royal collection she enriched beyond measure, filling it with treasures, saving it from the dispersals of the past, building it into one of the great collections of the world. The bankruptcy in Mary's life was of an entirely different kind, the emotional bankruptcy of a heart so suppressed that it could not give or receive, the love that makes a life rich in the ways that matter most. She was bankrupt in feeling, impoverished in warmth, unable to express the love that her rigid control locked away. And this emotional bankruptcy was the real and devastating poverty at the center of her existence, the impoverishment that no treasure could ever remedy, the bankruptcy that her obsession with objects both expressed and concealed. The woman who enriched the royal collection impoverished herself in the things that matter most. She gathered treasure beyond price and could not give her children warmth. She built one of the greatest collections in the world and could not express her love to the people who needed it. She surrounded herself with beauty and security and magnificence and lived inside it all a life of emotional poverty, the rich collection a substitute for the riches of feeling she could neither give nor receive. The treasures she accumulated were the answer to her financial insecurity, the hedge against the precariousness of her childhood. They were no answer at all to the deeper insecurity, the emotional insecurity, the inability to love and connect that lay beneath the whole of her controlled and suppressed existence. She solved the problem of financial security and could not solve the problem of the heart, gathered the treasures that could not be taken away and lost the warmth that cannot be gathered, ended her long and magnificent life as one of the loneliest and most self-denying figures ever to occupy a throne. And so the treasures she gathered still glitter in the royal palaces, the magnificent collection she built and saved and enriched, admired by the millions, who passed through the great houses she filled with beauty. The doll's house still stands at Windsor, the perfect miniature world she loved. The recovered relics of her dynasty, the treasures she hunted down and brought home, remain in the collection she devoted her life to. The jewels she was given, and the objects she acquired, by purchase and by gift and by the soft coercion that could not be refused, endure as part of the crown's splendor. The collection is her monument, the great achievement of her obsessive life. The thing she gathered against the insecurity of her childhood, and the substitute for the warmth she could neither give nor receive. And behind the glittering monument stands the woman who built it, magnificent and forbidding and impoverished, the poor relation who became queen, the wounded girl who gathered treasure against the precariousness she had known, the mother who could love objects but not her own children, the servant of the crown who gave her whole humanity to an institution and kept nothing for herself. She was, in the final reckoning, a woman who had been taught, in a childhood of debt and humiliation and the flight from creditors, that beautiful and valuable things were the only security that could not be taken away, and who spent the rest of her life proving the lesson true and discovering, too late if she ever discovered it at all, how incomplete a security it was. The treasures could not be taken away, and the treasures could not love her, and Mary gathered them anyway, filling the void that no object could fill, building the fortress that kept out the warmth along with the chaos, accumulating against the insecurity of her origins the beauty that answered her fear and left her need for love unmet. It is a sad and a human story behind the magnificent and forbidding facade, the story of a wounded woman who could give her heart to her treasures and not to her family, who served an institution with a devotion that consumed her, who built a great collection on the foundation of an emotional poverty that no greatness could relieve. The obsession did not bankrupt the royal collection. It enriched it beyond measure, made it one of the wonders of the world, filled it with the treasures that Mary gathered with such relentless and obsessive love. The obsession bankrupted something else entirely, something that no treasure could restore and no collection could replace. It bankrupted the woman herself, impoverished her heart, starved her family of the warmth she could not give, left her magnificent and forbidding and alone inside the fortress of treasure and control and devotion she had built against the insecurity of her impoverished youth. The royal collection she made rich. Herself, her warmth, her capacity for love, her family she made poor. And that in the end is the truest verdict on Mary of Teck, the saviour of the royal collection and the casualty of her own suppressed heart. The woman whose obsession with treasure was the measure of everything she had lost and could never gather back, whose magnificent collection still glitters in the palaces, while the warmth she could not give went with her, unspoken and unexpressed, into the grave. The obsession never bankrupted the royal collection, it bankrupted her. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.